In this next episode, you're about to hear 2 hours of confessions, field recordings, and guide logs, pulled from people and places that don't make the news, and probably never will. And the people telling the stories, most of them will never be heard from again. All of these stories point to the same thing. Something out there is hiding from view, or worse yet, it's being hidden. So you better stay alert, because once you know what's buried beneath the world around you, you might start to experience it too. Don't say you weren't warned. I worked in Yellowstone, spent years of my life out there. I knew the land, the trails, the wildlife. I thought I was on top of my game with my job. But now, honestly, I don't think I know anything. This started about 3 years ago in September. That in-between time, tourists are gone, bears are edgy, everything starts to go quiet. I had a patrol out in the thoroughfare region. That's deep backcountry. No roads, no radio towers. Takes a couple days just to hike in. It's about as cut off as you can get. At the time, I liked that part of the job, being alone out there. But before I even left, I felt off. Sick to my stomach packing my gear. No reason for it. And once I crossed into the backcountry, my radio died, just like that. No warning. I figured it was just signal interference, but still, weird. Anyway, I hiked in like usual. Logged the weather, checked trail markers, stopped by the patrol cabin about 30 miles in. It was all routine, but the woods felt empty. And I mean empty. No tracks, no sign of animals, no scat, no broken branches. Just this clean, unnatural stillness. The air felt heavy too. Not storm heavy, just thick. My ears were ringing off and on, like altitude sickness. But I wasn't that high up. That night I stayed in the cabin. One room, cot, stove, busted window, I'd meant to fix for months. I locked the door out of habit. Nothing out there but bears, right? Except that night, there weren't even normal night sounds. No wind, no crickets, just this vacuum of quiet. And then, sometime after 2 in the morning, I heard footsteps. Not heavy, not hurried. Just slow, deliberate crunches around the outside of the cabin. Step, pause, step. I froze, listened. It circled the whole place. Once, twice. Just the sound of someone or something walking. No dragging, no huffing, no voice, no flashlight beam. Just steps. And then nothing. I didn't sleep after that. When the sun came up, I went outside. No tracks. No signs of anything. Ground was soft enough that there should have been something, but it was clean, like it had never happened. I told myself it was just nerves. Isolation messes with people. I've seen it. Explained it away like I've done with other rangers over the years. I kept going. Next day, I hiked up to the ridge to try the radio again. The trail's narrow. Drop off on one side, dense woods on the other. About an hour in, I heard a branch snap behind me. I stopped, looked, nothing. Took a few more steps, another snap. It wasn't just once, it kept happening. Always behind me, always just out of sight. I picked up the pace. It did too. When I finally got to the ridge and tried the radio, I was shaking. Didn't tell anyone what was going on. Just gave my weather check-in and signed off. Didn't want it on record. Took a different trail down. Easier, quieter. And that's when I saw it. At first glance, I thought it was a person. Tall, motionless, standing between 2 trees. But it was off. Too tall. Arms too long. Head tilted in this unnatural way, like it was trying to figure me out. No pack, no gear, just standing there. I raised a hand. Didn't say anything. Just a gesture like, "Hey, you okay?" It didn't move. Didn't blink. Then, without walking, it slid behind the tree, like it was on rails or something. No shifting weight, no sound. I ran toward the spot, twisted my ankle doing it. When I got there, nothing, no one, no footprints, no broken branches, just that same weird pressure in the air. I limped back to the cabin by sunset, locked the door the second I got inside. No sleep again. Every sound felt loaded. There was a moment just before dawn, when I swear I heard slow breathing outside the broken window. I turned to look. Nothing. But there was fog on the glass, like someone had exhaled on it. The next morning I opened the cabin door, and there it was. My ranger patch, the one that was sewn onto my sleeve the day before, just lying on the threshold, perfectly clean cut, not torn, cut, like something had taken it from me and left it as a reminder. That's when I bailed. Didn't eat. Didn't even tie my boots right. I packed fast, left half my gear, and hiked out without stopping. Didn't care about the ankle, just needed to be gone. I filed a report when I got back, kept it vague. Possible predator behavior, area felt off, that kind of thing. Nobody questioned it. Someone asked if I ran into a grizzly. I just said, yeah, something like that. Tried to shake it off. Took a long shower that didn't help. Slept for 14 hours straight and told myself I was done with the deep backcountry for good. But it didn't end. A week later, I heard scratching at my apartment. Not mice, bigger, stronger. Once I turned on the bathroom light and something ducked out of view at the window. Gone before I could move. I told a retired ranger. Figured he'd laugh. He didn't. Just looked at me and said, "You went too far in." Then he told me to burn everything I wore on that trip. Said, "Don't let it get attached." So I did. Uniform, boots, burned it all. Smelled like wet copper and pine needles. I moved. Took a desk job. Started over. Felt normal for a while. Then one night, as I was locking up the nature center at closing, I felt it again. That silence, that pressure. And I just knew. It had found me again. I looked toward the tree line, saw something move. Same rhythm, same slow pace. It stepped out, still tall, still wrong, but different this time. Like it was trying on a new version of itself, testing it out. It tilted its head at me, then raised an arm, slowly. In its hand was a strip of dark green fabric, my old uniform sleeve. It dropped it, turned, and disappeared into the woods. No sound, no tracks, just gone. I quit the next day, moved out of state, new name, no forwarding address. Now I make hiking maps for places I'll never go. But sometimes, when it's really quiet, I still hear it. In the walls, outside the window, somewhere behind the trees. Always slow, always just close enough to remind me. You saw me, I saw you. And if you think this is just a story, fine. I really hope it is. But if you're ever deep in the woods, and the air shifts, and the quiet gets too quiet, don't stop. Don't look. Just leave. Because it remembers, and it waits. I haven't told many people about this, but I feel like I've reached a point where I just need to get it off my chest. I've fished the Michigan side of Lake Huron for most of my life, specifically around the Tawas area, where I keep a modest little cabin right on the shoreline. It's not fancy, just a small structure that stood for at least 40 years, and the dock is older than I am, made of heavy timbers that I've had to repair more times than I can count. I was out on the water just before dawn on July 10th of this year, aiming to catch walleye. I've always found that the best luck is right as the sun comes up and the water is calmer, which I find so peaceful, like you're on a different planet when everything's that quiet. After a few hours, I headed back in, tied the boat, and planned to leave my gear in the shed for the afternoon. I remember it being muggy, the kind of humidity that makes you break a sweat just breathing. So I was eager to unload quickly and head inside to cool off. As soon as I stepped onto the dock, something felt off. Not in the sense that something was physically broken, but more like I was suddenly aware that I wasn't alone. I felt that before when a raccoon or fox might be lurking around, so I shuffled along quietly just in case. The first thing I noticed was an odd stench, kind of that wet dog smell but sharper and more pungent. It was strong enough to make me flinch, but I just assumed maybe there was a dead fish, or maybe a cormorant had left something behind. But then I saw the marks on the far end of the dock, close to where the boat's bow touches. Deep gashes carved into the wooden boards, well beyond what I'd attribute to normal wear and tear, or even a large dog's claws. They were at least a quarter-inch deep, spaced like the width of a large hand if you spread your fingers out fully. But they clearly had a pattern that looked like some kind of claw. Not a single slash or two. There were several sets, and the wood was splintered at the edges. It looked like whatever did it had put some serious force behind it. I actually ran my finger along one of the grooves and got a bit of a sliver right away. I looked around to see if someone was maybe playing a prank, but the area was empty. The nearest neighbor is a quarter mile up the shore, and they're older folks who wouldn't exactly wander onto my property in the middle of the night, and it didn't match the marks of any typical tool I've seen. Too jagged, too uneven, almost like something had been pawing or scratching in a frenzy. I called out, kind of a reflex, I guess, but nobody responded. I felt this creeping sense that something unseen was still there. I checked behind the cabin, back by where the walkway leads into the trees, and I swear I caught a glimpse of what could have been part of a large, dark silhouette moving among the firs. I was so keyed up that even the wind rustling the leaves made me jump. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe a stray dog or a coyote, but it would have to be massive to leave gouges like that in solid timber. Now, I'm not new to weird stuff. My grandfather used to tell stories of odd sightings near the Huron National Forest back in the 60s. He'd spin tales of large canine-like creatures that would roam the roads at night, scaring travelers and sometimes even tearing up campsite gear. Always chalked it up to tall tales, local legends. But something about those dock scratches reminded me of the feral details he used to describe. If he was still around, I think he'd have gotten excited by it, maybe teased me about it. The night after I discovered the marks, I couldn't sleep. It wasn't just nerves, I was curious. I ended up sitting on my porch with the lights out, just listening to the insects and the waves lapping at the shore. Around midnight, maybe a bit after, I heard this low growling sound. Not a bear growl, which I've heard before in the Upper Peninsula, and definitely not a coyote either. I couldn't see much, but it came from the same general direction where I saw that silhouette. The growl was so deep it almost rattled my chest. Then there was a heavy shuffle in the brush, like something shifting its weight. My flashlight beam was pretty weak, and by the time I flicked it on, the sound had stopped. I found nothing but a few flattened ferns near the tree line in the morning. Another thing worth mentioning is that the night before I discovered the scratches, I recall hearing some kind of commotion out on the water. That's what initially woke me up. It was a splash or multiple splashes, like something large either jumping in or thrashing around. I've heard sturgeons can cause quite a ruckus, but this sounded different, more frantic. At the time, I dismissed it and fell back asleep, figuring maybe a beaver was slapping its tail, or some fish were active near the surface. But in retrospect, it lines up suspiciously with finding those marks on the dock. I did ask around a bit, though carefully, because I don't want folks thinking I'm losing it. My uncle in Oscoda told me he'd heard rumors about sightings of a tall wolf-like figure near some campsites along the Osable River. But people are always coming up with stories out here, especially after a few beers around the bonfire. Still, the specifics he recalled, like describing that eerily human stance some folks claimed, really made the hair stand on my arms. I haven't told him about the claw marks on my dock yet, because I'm still not sure what to make of it myself. I keep going back to that strong, foul odor too. I've fished with some real hardcore guys, and none of them have mentioned anything quite like that, except one old friend who hunts near Onaway. He once talked about stumbling on a kill site, some deer carcass that, as he put it, smelled like an ashtray full of dog slobber, or something along those lines. He swore he saw unnaturally large footprints around it. A couple of times a year, local talk flares up about a dog man, but it's always brushed off as local lore. I can't help but wonder now. Part of me regrets not taking pictures of the marks right away, because I ended up patching the boards with wood filler. I didn't even think to photograph until after I'd done the repairs. It's so easy for folks to dismiss me as telling tall tales without proof. My dock remains scarred, though. Those deep channels didn't fill perfectly, and you can still see faint outlines. I can also testify they weren't made by normal wildlife, like a raccoon or a fisher cat. I've seen tracks from those creatures, and they're nothing like the scale of what I saw. I'll tell you one more odd thing. Earlier this week, I found a single paw print in the soft mud, about maybe 20 yards from my dock. The pad was clear, with 4 toe imprints, but the sheer size was jarring, bigger than my own hand. It had rained lightly the night before, so it was a fresh track. I tried comparing it to a wolf print chart I found online, and while it looked vaguely similar in shape, the dimensions were off. Bigger than any wolf or large dog I've ever known around here. I'm no cryptid hunter. This is all new territory for me. But after seeing what I've seen, I don't know what else to call it. I keep a loaded rifle in the cabin now, which I've never bothered to do before. I'm trying not to let this ruin the peace I've always felt coming up here. But every time I step out onto the dock or wander along the shore, I can't shake the feeling that something is observing me. It's made me second guess going out pre-dawn to fish, and that's been a routine for me for decades. I want to lay this out while it's still fresh, though my head is all over the map right now. I was out checking on some underground lines here in Birmingham. This was about a week and a half ago, maybe closer to 2 weeks. I was assigned to do a typical inspection along a main flood tunnel that branches out under Morris Avenue and leads towards some older sections of the storm drainage system near Sloss Furnaces. Normally, this kind of work is just routine, nothing out of the ordinary apart from the usual rats, roaches, and the occasional snake slithering around. I've been doing these inspections for over 10 years, and I've gotten pretty desensitized to random critters scurrying by. But this time felt weird from the get-go. The air was heavier than usual, and there was an odd echoing sound that didn't line up with just water or any typical disturbance. I remember it was right after we had some heavy rain the previous week, maybe Wednesday, because the flooding complications were the entire reason our department wanted these lines checked sooner rather than later. They were worried debris might have built up. Around noon, I was descending through a manhole near First Avenue North, not far from the new development area that the city's been messing around with. You know how they've been repurposing old buildings into lofts and all that? Well, the tunnel I was going into leads into a broader channel that passes under some older parts of downtown. The signage down there is sometimes mislabeled or just plain missing, but I generally know my way around. Anyway, as I got deeper into the system, I noticed the water level was at least half a foot higher than normal. Didn't think anything of it, just normal runoff. The farther I went, the more it smelled. Like stagnant water, sure, but also something else, like a mix of sulfur and rotting meat. It was foul. I actually remembered a coworker once complaining about a similar odor under the Fifth Avenue flood basin, but that turned out to be a dead possum snagged on some rebar. This smell was more pervasive, like it was baked into the walls. Hard to explain. I ended up having to stoop in certain patches where the ceiling slopes downward. The only light I had was from my headlamp, and a small flashlight I keep clipped to my belt for emergencies, which I ended up using more because my headlamp was flickering a bit. The city hadn't changed out some of the older electrical fixtures, so it's a pretty dark maze down there. I walked for a good 45 minutes, just stopping to check for any cracks or backups. You get used to hearing your own breath pretty loud in that kind of enclosed space. At some point, I became aware of a strange scraping noise that echoed from further down the tunnel. I thought it might be some leftover debris shifting with the current, but it had a rhythm to it, like something deliberate. I slowed down and tried to see if maybe an animal was stuck. The next few steps were tense. Things felt claustrophobic. I kept hearing that scrape and then a drip, scrape and then a drip. The tunnel walls are ancient in some stretches, so even the slightest sound can bounce around in crazy ways. In a small junction area just beyond a sloped corner, I caught sight of something that made my stomach drop. It was crouched low, pale, and it moved almost like it was spooked by my light. I only caught a glimpse of its shape, kind of humanoid but not quite right. I couldn't see much detail at first because it bolted out of the beam of my flashlight. I nearly lost my footing. There's moss and slick algae on those concrete surfaces. Everything about it screamed that this wasn't just some overgrown cat or a dog that got lost. Its torso was too thin, its limbs too long. If I had to guess, I'd say it was maybe around my height if it stood fully upright. around 5.5 or 6 feet. But all I really saw were these elongated arms and this pale, almost grayish skin. No fur or anything like that. I doubled back for a second just to get my bearings. I couldn't believe I was seeing something like that. I caught my breath, then slowly tried to edge around the corner with my flashlight extended. I kept thinking about old stories you hear around the city. People talking about weird sightings near abandoned steel tunnels or something in the outskirts of the Cahaba River Basin. But this was the heart of downtown. It felt impossible. Then again, Sloss Furnaces has its own share of ghost stories, so maybe there's more going on beneath Birmingham than folks realize. I tried to call out to see if maybe it was a person who was hurt or in distress, though I had a pit in my stomach telling me it wasn't. I heard my own voice echo, and then I picked up scuttling, like hands and feet digging into the concrete, propelling something away fast. I shined my light around and saw it again for maybe a split second. This time, it was pressed against the side of the tunnel near a junction opening that feeds into a deeper overflow chamber. I never got a clear look at its face, but I could see enough that it was definitely not wearing clothes. It was just this raw, pale figure clinging to the wall. Its limbs looked unnatural, almost insect-like in how they bent. Moments later, it darted through the opening, into pitch black. There was a scraping echo that faded pretty quickly. My heart was racing. I thought to myself, you gotta be kidding me. Something like that can't be down here. But it was. And the smell I mentioned earlier, it was stronger where I'd last seen it. Pungent and just vile. I actually gagged. I didn't immediately chase after it because, let's be honest, I'm not about to follow a bizarre, contorted figure blindly into a deeper flood tunnel. I also wasn't sure if it might be more than one. You hear stories about wild animals living in packs down in sewers, so I wasn't taking any chances. I decided to exit the way I came, though I'll admit that every little sound, dripping water, the shuffle of my boots, had me on edge. I kept flashing my light behind me, expecting to see it creeping up, but I only caught emptiness. By the time I got back above ground, I was drenched in sweat. My coworker was on the street above, waiting near the truck. I tried to explain that I saw something that made no sense. A crawler-looking figure was the closest description I could manage. He just gave me a blank stare and said something like, "We're done for the day. Let's report any structural findings tomorrow." I didn't bring it up right away. Honestly, I wasn't sure how to state it without sounding unhinged, but the image of that thing stuck with me all night. I barely slept. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that pale figure clinging to the tunnel wall. A day or so later, I finally mustered the courage to tell a friend about it. He told me there have been random rumors on certain YouTube channels discussing crawler humanoids. That freaked me out even more. I did a bit of my own searching, though I tried to focus on local incidents. Didn't find anything conclusive, just the usual cryptid chatter. But I'm telling you, this was no rumor. I saw that thing with my own eyes, down where nobody should realistically survive for too long, especially in those deeper water channels. The city has never mentioned anything like this in any official capacity, to me or my teammates, even though they plan expansions and revamps in the older tunnels. I still see that pale silhouette in my mind, and my gut says there might be more than one. It's just a feeling, the way the scraping sounded almost collective, if that makes any sense. It's purely speculation, but I can't shake it. I kept thinking back to older stories from folks who used to handle sewer mapping near Red Mountain, about odd shapes in the darkness, or how some workers refused to go back after hearing unsettling laughter echoing through the pipes. I always dismissed those as tall tales, but now I'm not so sure. I've been caretaker here at my aunt's farm near Wabash, Indiana, for the better part of 2 years now, and I've never had anything stranger than a stray coyote or a rogue raccoon messing with the hens. Even back in early spring, when we had that unusual warm spell that seemed to bring every critter out of hiding, I just dealt with foxes and the occasional hawk. But for the last couple of months, something else has been going on, something I can barely wrap my mind around. I'm convinced reptilian beings are sneaking onto the property and stealing our chickens. It sounds far-fetched, I know, but what I've seen, and what I've heard from others in the county, leaves me with little doubt. I keep the chicken coop behind the old barn, which itself was built sometime in the late 1960s. My uncle swore it was 1967, but I'm not entirely certain. It's set back about 50 yards from the main house, and there's a tall wooden fence around it because we used to keep hogs in the same enclosure. Anyway, about 6 weeks ago, I started noticing odd footprints out by the fence line. I first thought they might be large turkey tracks, though that didn't make sense in the pattern they were laid out. They didn't look like any normal bird print either, because they were more elongated, almost like a three-toed shape but narrower than I'd expect from a raptor or large bird. Plus, turkeys don't usually leave such distinct claw marks. I shrugged it off at first, thinking maybe a new predator had moved into the area. Then about a week later, I realized the feed barrel was knocked over. No raccoon or fox could have done that without leaving some serious scratch marks on either the barrel or the gate. And yet, it was on its side, feed scattered everywhere. One of the fence planks looked like it had been pried off from the top corner down, like something reached over and yanked it outward. And here's where it gets weird. I found these dull greenish-gray scales that look crusty, but kind of flexible, almost like thick lizard skin. Initially, I thought it might be from a big snake, but these pieces were too large for any snake we'd get here in Indiana. Plus, the shape was wrong. I mentioned it casually at a feed supply store in Wabash proper when I was picking up extra straw. One of the older men sitting by the wood stove in the back told multiple stories of lizard people sightings, but I chalked it up to small-town gossip. He was rambling about something that had happened back in 1978 near the Wabash River, insisted that the police had come out, found unidentified footprints, and sealed the whole thing off. I was only half listening at the time, but his words stuck with me. Then about 3 days after that, I noticed 3 of our best-laying hens had completely disappeared overnight. No fur, no blood, just some feathers scattered around the fence, and more of those elongated, claw-like tracks. Usually, if coyotes get a chicken, you see a mess. They tear them apart right there. Hawks usually leave behind chunked bits or drop them somewhere. An animal like a fox would drag it off, but again, you'd see something. This was like they just vanished. I got more serious about patrolling at night. On a clear night around 2 a.m., I heard this low chattering noise, like a gurgling hiss, almost like how you might imagine an alligator might sound if it could speak. At first, I thought maybe 2 raccoons were squabbling, but I'm very familiar with raccoon chatter, and this had a vibrating quality to it that was totally different. I was armed with a flashlight and an old 20 gauge. I shone the beam around the fence line and spotted something moving quickly away from the coop. The glimpse I got was just a flash, like a tall, thin figure hunched slightly, with a tail dragging behind. It was so fast that I almost doubted what I'd seen, but the tail was unmistakable. It slipped off into the cornfields behind the barn. My heart nearly jumped out of my chest. I didn't sleep much that night. The next morning, I gathered up enough nerve to scout around where it disappeared. The corn stalks were parted in a neat path, like something quite big went through, and more scales, similar to what I saw before, were snagged on the broken stalks. I tucked them into a mason jar and have them stashed in the basement now. Ever since then, the sightings and signs have been sporadic but consistent. Sometimes it's footprints, sometimes it's that strange chattering, and sometimes it's a missing bird or two. About a week ago, I found the feathers of one of our white leghorns leading all the way to the creek. The footprints in the mud there were deeper and clearer than any I've seen yet. They had 3 distinct forward toes tipped with claws that seemed to press a few inches into the soft ground. Between each toe was this webbing or scaly stretch. It reminded me of a large lizard foot, but bigger. I'm talking maybe 6 to 8 inches across at the widest point. No typical Midwest predator leaves a track like that. I keep thinking about whether these reptilian beings are operating alone, or if there's more than one. The older man in town told me that a lot of folks around here used to claim sightings near the old Devil's Backbone stretch of the Wabash River, though I never heard it called that until he mentioned it. He said there were rumors that the local sheriff's department had some hush-hush arrangement with the feds to keep folks away from that area after dark. I can't confirm or deny that, but my father did mention once, decades ago, about some high strangeness in the river bottoms. At the time, I thought he was talking about bootleggers or something from Prohibition days, though that never made complete sense time-wise. Lately, I've been calling around to a couple of other farms, just folks I know from the local farmers' co-op. I'm hearing stories that they too have lost chickens or small livestock in odd ways. One woman up near North Manchester said she lost a full-grown ewe last month. Something tore through the side of her wire fencing, as if it weren't there. The strangest part was that the ewe vanished without so much as a blood trail. She found a chunk of that same kind of crusty scale near the paddock. That's the point where I really stopped doubting my own experiences. There's no way multiple farmers are randomly blaming big lizard-like creatures if there isn't at least some thread of truth. I'm trying my best to document everything as thoroughly as I can. My only real connection to the outside world is the local library's internet and my phone, though I mostly rely on an old-school camera these days because the phone photos come out so grainy at night. I'd love to send you pictures, but they mostly turn out black, with a floating speck of light here and there. I might try setting up a couple of trail cameras, though I'm apprehensive about what'll happen if these reptilian beings realize they're being surveilled. The fence gets torn up pretty badly already. I'm trying not to give them a reason to do more damage. I haven't involved local law enforcement yet, because I can already imagine how that conversation goes. Yes, sir, I'd like to report a lizard creature stealing chickens. They'd probably do a quick drive-by, see nothing, and say I need to cut back on coffee. That, or they'd show up with a bunch of SUVs and men in suits, telling me to keep my mouth shut. That's how these things go in the stories you see on certain corners of the internet. But for now, I've installed extra motion sensor lights. I find them triggered in the middle of the night, but by the time I run out, I see nothing but swaying corn stalks or a rustling in the tall grass behind the barn. It feels like I'm living in some bizarre horror flick out in the heartland. My sister, who lives in Fort Wayne, thinks I'm just stressed and hearing coyotes or raccoons. But she hasn't stepped foot here in over a year. She hasn't seen the footprints, the shredded fence boards, the scales, or the scattered feathers. I almost took her out to the creek the other day to point out the tracks, but the rain had washed them away by the time she came, which makes me question my sanity sometimes. But then another chicken goes missing, the feeders get smashed, and I find those weird footprints again. I'm sending all this to you because I know you have that YouTube channel where you discuss these kind of stories, and part of me hopes sharing it beyond my small circle might prompt someone else with a similar situation to speak up. I don't know who else to talk to about this without sounding like I've gone off the deep end. If I could manage to be calm enough to get a good look at one of these things, or even some decent photos or video evidence, I'd feel less like I'm chasing shadows. But my nerves can't take much more of these silent prowlers after dark. Most of what Officer Mark Ellison saw in the woods in Michigan that night was never written down, because the parts that mattered were scrubbed from every report, deleted from every file, and erased from every camera. But ask him now, years later, and he'll tell you, the thing they found wasn't a bear, wasn't a man, and wasn't at all confused about what it was doing. It was watching, it was waiting, and the worst part is, the government already knew it was there. Here's how it all went down, in Mark's own words. Alright, I'm just gonna lay this out. You can believe me or not, but this all happened on October 12th, 2017 in Manistee National Forest, Michigan. I was still with the state police back then, Post 66 Cadillac. I was night shift, but wasn't even supposed to be working that night. I had swapped shifts with Jeff so he could go hunting. I think about that a lot. If I'd just kept my schedule, none of this would have landed on me. Dispatch got a call around 10:42 p.m. A woman out near Wellston, panicked and rambling about her husband. She said he went into the woods behind their property to check out some screaming. That word stuck with me. Not howling, not yelling. Screaming, human sounding. Said it started around 10, and after 10 minutes of it, her husband grabbed his pistol and a flashlight and told her to lock the door. Johnson and I headed out there, thinking it was probably just a black bear or some other animal. Nothing too crazy. Nothing that didn't have a clear explanation. We get to the property, she comes out to meet us in the driveway barefoot, clearly out of her mind with worry. Kept saying, it looked wrong. It looked all wrong. We start heading into the woods. We're a bit nervous. It's dead quiet. Not the kind of quiet you get late at night. Just this blank silence. Even our footsteps didn't sound right. Surprisingly, we found the guy's flashlight maybe 40 yards in, still on, laying sideways in a small clearing. There were marks in the dirt, like drag marks. You could see where something heavy had been pulled. No sign of a struggle, just a straight line like something had been dragged along. Then we heard this sound. I don't even know how to describe it exactly. It was trying to sound like a growl, but it was off. Like a recording played backward, but too wet and too long. It felt fake in the worst way, like it came from something that had learned how to mimic sound but didn't know when to stop. We both stopped cold. Johnson whispered, "That ain't right," again and again. Then we saw it, just beyond the first few rows of trees, partially lit by the beam from Johnson's flashlight, standing behind a pine. It was big, 8 feet or more, with this hunched posture like it was used to being on all fours, but was trying to stand up. Arms hung lower than they should, like it didn't know what to do with them. Legs were bent in a way I can't explain. Not like animal legs, just nothing I can explain. Like it wasn't built for this world. It stepped forward once, just enough for us to see it better, then slipped back behind the tree like it was teasing us. I felt this buzzing in my chest. Not fear, not adrenaline, like standing too close to a power transformer. Every hair on my body was up. Then the trees started clicking. That's the only word I've got. Clicking. Like sticks being snapped, but fast and from all directions. It wasn't random. It was rhythmic, coordinated. I don't know how else to say it. It felt like communication. I went for my radio. Nothing. Dead air. No static. No tone. Like it wasn't even turned on, though I checked twice. Johnson dropped to his knees and started dry heaving. Said he smelled metal and dirt, like a butcher shop buried underground. I didn't smell anything, but the look on his face told me he wasn't faking. Then we heard it move. Quick. Just a blur across the edge of the clearing. I turned and heard a snap behind me. There, hanging from a low branch, was a buck, strung up by its back legs like it had been field dressed, only it hadn't. No cuts, just hanging there. Johnson screamed and started running. I hesitated and looked back toward where we saw the thing, and now it was standing just outside the trees. No more hiding. Its face was shaped like a human skull, but stretched. The features were there but distorted. The eyes didn't blink right. They went sideways like some deep-sea fish. It tilted its head and I swear it grinned, wide and slow, like it knew something we didn't. Then it stepped forward again. The sound under its foot wasn't leaves. It was crunching, and I know that sound. That was bone. Small ones. Dozens of them. We ran. I grabbed Johnson by the jacket, and we bolted back to the house. I didn't look back until we got to the tree line. When I did, it was behind us, just watching, and it lifted its arm and waved, slow and deliberate. 2 fingers, like it was saying, "You made it this time." Backup showed maybe 15 minutes later. We went back in with 6 guys and 2 dogs. The dogs wouldn't go in. They just laid down and whimpered. We pushed forward without them. Found the husband about 60 yards off the trail, tucked between some rocks. He was curled up in survival mode. We had to carry him out. His back had 3 long, thin gouges running from his shoulders to his waist. No blood trail. No sign of infection. Just these clean, precise lines like something had marked him. I don't know how else to say it. Next day, we're out there looking for evidence of something, anything to corroborate what we saw. And don't you know it, 4 black SUVs roll up, no plates. 4 guys in gray gear, no badges, no names. They took over the scene like they had a script. Told our captain it was a wildlife incident and that we weren't needed anymore. We tried to question it, but he shut us down. Said it came from higher up, way higher. They took our body cams, said they were faulty. Our incident report got reviewed, then came back with pages added that we didn't write. Whole parts of the timeline changed. The woman and her husband were relocated by the end of the week. No one said where. Johnson resigned within days. Said he couldn't stop dreaming about the sound it made. He moved to Arizona. Took a job at a gas station last I heard. Said he needed something real simple and mindless. I made it a few more months, but I started dreading every shift. Couldn't even drive past a stand of trees without sweating. Look, people joke about dogman stories up here. I used to also. But whatever we saw, it wasn't a story, even though it looked like something from folklore. Something that could hide in plain sight if it wanted to. And whoever those guys were in the SUVs, they didn't seem nervous or surprised. They didn't ask questions. They were cleaning up something, which means they knew. I'm telling this now because if I don't, it goes with me. And because that thing out there, it wasn't done. It let us leave on purpose, and that's not the same as being safe. I've been debating if I should even send this because it still feels so raw and weird. But after going back and forth, I decided, what the heck? I'm just a middle-aged guy from Munising, Michigan, who's been fishing the southern shore of Lake Superior since I was a teen. And in all my years out on the water, I've never witnessed anything close to what happened this past Tuesday morning, July 11th, 2023 to be exact. I'm still shaky thinking about it, but I'll do my best to lay it out for your YouTube channel because it might jog the memory of other folks who've seen something similar. I was out by Grand Island, the stretch of water just off the pictured rocks area, around 6 a.m. The skies were partly cloudy, and the lake was calm, just a slight ripple on the surface. I remember mulling over whether to head up toward Miner's Castle or circle back toward Chapel Beach, since the salmon run's been surprisingly active. Actually, the fishing's been decent despite the weird cold snaps we've had. You know how Lake Superior weather can be. Beautiful and pastel one minute, cold and steel gray the next. But Tuesday was fairly mild, so I set up a couple of trolling lines for cohos and was basically drifting, keeping an eye on my fish finder. At some point, around 6:30 or so, I started daydreaming about this old story my dad used to tell me. He claimed to have seen a massive sturgeon near Autrain back in the 1980s that he believed was older than any of us, practically a prehistoric beast. The device beeped, snapping me back to the present, and I noticed a pretty good reading on the fish finder. It looked bigger than an average trout or salmon. My first thought was that I'd maybe stumbled across one of those giant lake sturgeons or a humongous muskie. My heart always races a bit when I see a big mark like that, because you never know if you're about to hook a real trophy. Next thing I knew, the line jerked hard. I stood up to check the rods, and I caught a glimpse of something just beneath the surface. It was an enormous black silhouette gliding in the water toward the back of my boat. I thought it was a large fish, until I noticed it seemed to have something resembling ears, like almost triangular tips that surfaced for a second. It was so bizarre that I stopped everything I was doing. I let the reel go slack just so I could focus on whatever this thing was. It didn't behave like a fish at all. It moved a bit slower, more purposeful, almost patrolling. As it passed my stern, I saw what I swear looked like broad shoulders under the water. Not a fin or tail the way you'd see on a sturgeon or muskie. I know how all this sounds. If I hadn't been so close, I'd probably say it was just a log or maybe some weird wave phenomenon. But I've seen logs floating. I've seen otters. I've seen beavers. I've seen bears swim across smaller lakes, and none of them move like that. This was fluid, but big, and that shaped head or ears, whatever they were, just stuck out for a moment. Gave me the creeps. It reminded me of a huge dog silhouette if a dog learned to swim and somehow grew to a size that's just not natural. I moved around the boat, trying to keep my eyes on it. The water was so strangely dark, though, and the morning light wasn't the best, which frustrated me. I wanted a better look. It just kept gliding parallel to me before it vanished into deeper water. Part of me was so startled I just stood there with my mouth open. I tried to convince myself it could be some deformed bear or a stray black wolf that took a plunge. But we're talking deep water at Lake Superior, a good half-mile offshore. I've known guys who swear up and down they've seen dogman-type creatures on land, in the Upper Peninsula, around the Seney Stretch, or near the Hiawatha National Forest. In fact, one old buddy from Marquette used to talk about hearing howls so unnatural they chilled his blood near some logging roads at night. But I never put much stock in that. I always chalked it up to local folklore or too many beers around the campfire. But this was different. It almost felt like it was curious about my boat. For a moment, I wondered if it could smell the fish or my bait. Let me tell you, I've heard rumors from older fishermen about large wolves that occasionally swim between islands. There are documented cases of wolves traveling across the Great Lakes ice in winter, but never anything about a dog-like creature that lurks under the water as if it belongs there. The fact that it didn't surface enough for me to see a snout or eyes still bothers me. All I saw was that black shape and the suggestion of ears. The sheer size of it. It had to span several feet from what looked like shoulders to back. I practically froze until it disappeared. What's odd is that I stayed out there probably another hour or so, half wanting to see if it would come back, half terrified it actually would. Every time a wave lapped against the boat or something brushed my lines, I jumped. I sort of lost my desire to fish, to be honest, but I didn't want to seem like a total coward by racing back to shore. Meanwhile, I couldn't stop thinking about all those stories about dogman sightings in Michigan. Most folks talk about seeing them near the forest edges or crossing roads, not swimming around in Lake Superior. I know Lake Superior has some strange history, shipwrecks, unexplained disappearances, you name it, but I never thought I'd be adding something cryptid related to that list. After I reeled in my lines, I headed back toward the docks near Sandpoint. I kept glancing over my shoulder, as if it would appear behind me like something out of a horror movie. My family was waiting at the cabin, wondering why I was jumpier than usual. I didn't mention a single word about the creature at first, because the logical part of my mind was still trying to piece together a more rational explanation. Then later that night, after dinner, I caved and told my brother, who just gave me this skeptical look. He asked if I was sure it wasn't just a seal, but Lake Superior doesn't have seals. And even if it were some rogue seal from who knows where, that doesn't account for the ear shape or the bulky shoulders. All I can think about now is how maybe these dogman reports are a lot more varied than I realized. If they're around on land, who's to say they can't swim? Dogs can swim. Wolves can swim, right? It's just I've never seen anything so big. And the bizarre way it stayed submerged except for that split-second glimpse of what I'm calling ears is haunting me. I keep replaying every angle, the shape, the movement, the slow, purposeful glide. It wasn't frantic or spooked. It was methodical, like it was aware of me and just didn't care. I've tried to research if there are any old tales about something like a dog-headed entity in the Great Lakes specifically, but all I end up finding are the standard dogman sightings inland or up near the forest lines. Not much about them being aquatic, which has made me feel really isolated with this experience. Still, I wanted to put this out there because maybe there's someone else who's run into a similar situation. My instincts tell me I wasn't just seeing a shadow or a trick of the light. I know the difference. Maybe someday I'll go back out around Grand Island at that same time and see if it shows up again, though part of me hopes I never do. I'm telling you, I've been on these waters for decades, and that day was different, beyond anything I can easily wrap my head around. If you decide to share this on your YouTube channel, I hope it can help piece together a bigger puzzle about whatever's out there. ARRL Marine Forecast can tell you about wave height and wind gusts, but apparently, no one's forecasting cryptid canines in the Great Lakes. I know I sound half crazed, but that's exactly what I saw, even though it's so freaky to admit it. I've been sitting on this for a long time, and every time I try to write it down, I get lost in all the details. There was a period back in the late 90s, around 97 or 98, when I was stationed at Camp Pendleton as part of the 1st Marine Division. I'd already done my time with a couple of scout sniper platoons by then, bouncing around from assigned posts in Okinawa to a short stint in the Gulf. Anyway, I ended up attached to some administrative duty for a few months, processing some intel reports and scanning classified material. It was mind-numbing to say the least, and at the time I cursed it. But looking back, that's when I happened upon some documents I still can't believe I saw. They were in a dull manila folder that looked no different from the billions of others in the office. I remember the folder number started with something like MCB0102, and it had Pendleton stamped across the tab in big block letters. My job was to skim through each file, confirm the reference ID matched what was on my checklist, and then sign off on it. Basically a paper trail meaning, yeah, we got it. But about halfway through this folder, there was a set of 3 or 4 typed pages that had been flagged for some reason. I recognized some acronyms I was familiar with, your typical intelligence references, location grids, and then something about unidentified canine-like entities. That phrase jumped out at me, and I ended up reading the thing line by line. I'm not sure how many people know this outside of select guys in military intelligence, but apparently there were these recurring sightings of something they referred to as DM or Dogman in the documents. It wasn't the official moniker, just more like a shorthand used in internal dispatches. The sightings supposedly happened out in the remote training ranges along the northeastern boundary of Pendleton, the sort of areas we typically use for live fire or specialized movement drills. Most of the accounts described a large wolf-like creature walking on its hind legs, spotted at a distance by perimeter patrols or recon teams. I can't confirm how high level these sightings went, but the reports were definitely compiled and passed upward through some channels. Whether it was just brushed off or actively kept under wraps, I can't say with 10% certainty. But judging by the dryness of the language, it was very matter-of-fact, these sightings need to be documented and not discussed further type of tone. I suspect it never saw the light of day outside of certain circles. There was a short chain of references that alluded to an incident in 1995, around Range 49, which is up in the northwestern corner of Pendleton. Some Marine recon guys were doing a late-night exercise, moving silently through rough terrain. They started picking up movement in their night vision scopes of what they thought were coyotes at first, maybe 2 or 3. Then they realized the silhouette was wrong. The gait was wrong. Everything about it was off. The document suggested these guys tried to confirm it was wildlife, but could never get close enough. One line said, I remember specifically, observers noted bipedal locomotion on 2 or more creatures. That made me do a double take. You don't see that described in official Marine intel too often. Another typed paragraph mentioned unusual tracks found near a weapons cache site a couple weeks later, around that same area. The tracks were described as elongated canine prints, but the stride length was bigger than anything the local wildlife typically had. Something like a 3 or 4 foot stride, if I recall, which is insane for an animal on all 4s, let alone 2 legs. The only reason I believe these reports had any merit is that it came from recon guys I actually knew, at least in passing. One of them was a quiet professional who once gave me tips on better concealment for desert ops. He was not the type to make up weird stories, even off the record. I don't know how widely circulated these documents were, but they looked legit. They had classification stamps, routing names, that standard Department of the Navy letterhead, the typical disclaimers about unauthorized dissemination. I remember feeling torn. Part of me wanted to tell some of my buddies, but I also knew that was a quick way to get hammered by the brass. So I kept my mouth shut and finished my assignment, and it all just got filed away. For a while, I thought maybe I'd imagined half of it, or that it was some bizarre training scenario or code for something else. But no, reading that text was as real as anything else I processed that day. Things got weirder once I left that admin duty and rotated back to more field work. I started hearing secondhand stories, not in official briefs, mind you, but over drinks at an oceanside bar or from a guy in the next bunk. People talked about strange howling in certain intervals at night near Basilone Road, especially in those more desolate spots. There's a big difference between how Marines talk about normal coyote chatter and how they talk about these howls. It had a different pitch, a different cadence. One guy made a passing remark about that upright wolf crap, then clammed up. It always seemed like folks wanted to say more but worried about sounding nuts, or worse, letting out something they were told to keep under wraps. I did a few specialized missions out in the remote parts of Pendleton, and I'll be honest, there were nights out there that gave me the creeps. I never actually saw anything that screamed, "There's a dogman out there," but we encountered weird tracks, found torn-up wildlife that didn't quite match the usual predator kills. The wildest part was hearing an odd, almost guttural sound echo off those hills. It wasn't a coyote. It wasn't a bobcat. I'd spent enough time in various environments, from the thick jungles in the Philippines to the desert around 29 Palms, to know typical animal calls. This was something else entirely, but I wasn't about to write a report on a strange noise. I only started feeling comfortable talking about this stuff after I retired in the mid-2000s, especially once I was out for good and not on contract or anything like that. Even then, I've never come forward publicly unless it's an anonymous forum or a message to someone I think might take it seriously. I'm still half expecting the Marine Corps to send me some form telling me to shut up. Chalk that up to old habits, I guess. I keep thinking back to those official documents. Black and white typed text with a crisp classification border. They read so clinically. Bipedal sightings consistent with large canine subjects. No direct contact. No injuries or casualties reported. You'd expect an official document to say something like, "No further action required." But instead, it specifically said, "Further sightings or corroboration demanded immediate follow-up." That's the line that stuck with me. If they were so quick to dismiss it, they wouldn't have asked for follow-ups. But the fact that you never see or hear about this stuff outside of hush-hush circles tells me there's more to it. Funny enough, a few years after I retired, I bumped into an old friend from when I was stationed at Pendleton. He asked if I remembered hearing about the werewolf files. He used that term jokingly, but he was basically talking about the same rumor of big upright canids. He claimed he'd seen a few pages referencing some controlled operation to investigate the sightings, and when he probed, he got stonewalled by a senior officer. He was told, "Don't go chasing legends, Marine," which is exactly how they handle topics they don't want lower ranks poking around in. I'm not sure where that leaves us. I don't have hard copies or photos of the documents. Even if I did, I'd probably be hammered by people calling me a hoaxer, and the rest might land me in a legal mess if I were passing around anything that's still considered restricted. What I do have are these memories of reading official text that absolutely corroborated stories about a bipedal canine creature, understood to be prowling around the outskirts of one of America's largest Marine Corps bases. That alone is enough to keep me up some nights, replaying the words in my head. I was on my usual early morning bus route in Snohomish County, right around 5:45 a.m., heading down the stretch between the Three Lakes area and Highway 9. This is typically the quietest part of my drive, and I've come to enjoy the routine of it, despite the early hour. The winter mornings here can be pitch black dark, and the only light you usually get is either from the moon, when it's out, or the dim glow of my bus headlights, because there aren't many street lamps in that more rural patch. Every so often, I'll catch a glimpse of some nocturnal wildlife, like deer or the occasional coyote, so I'm always on the lookout to avoid any collisions. Well, this one day, I'm pretty sure it was the first week of December last year, maybe the 3rd or 4th. I see what I initially thought was a large coyote, or perhaps a dog crossing the road about 20 feet ahead of me. But as I got closer, I realized it definitely wasn't any coyote or dog. I remember slowing down the bus because the shape wasn't matching up with anything typical, and it moved in this almost slithering stride, or that's how it looked under the limited light. The instant my headlights actually caught it, I saw a reflection off what looked like greenish, scaly skin. That's when I felt every hair on the back of my neck stand up. Honestly, I've never been a believer in this kind of thing. I grew up in Western Washington, and the weirdest wildlife I've ever encountered was a black bear rummaging near a dumpster. Nothing remotely bizarre, but the figure crossing the road that morning seemed vaguely humanoid, just not in any normal sense. The shape of it was tall, probably around 6 feet, maybe a bit less, but with a posture that wasn't quite upright. The limbs were elongated, and the skin, at least what I could see, had a sheen to it that didn't resemble fur or anything like that. The head seemed tapered, almost like what you'd imagine an upright lizard might look like. I had to slow to nearly a crawl, and I was worried that if it was some weird creature, I didn't want it to leap at the bus or something. It crossed in front of the headlights and disappeared on the other side of the brush. The strangest part is how it sort of crouched for a moment before darting away, as if it noticed me, or maybe just the bright lights. I didn't have any kids on board yet because this was my first loop before picking students up at Glacier Peak High School. My pickup usually starts closer to 6:10 or so I was alone in the bus, which made the whole thing even more unsettling. No one else there to confirm what I was seeing. After it vanished, I felt stuck in place for a good 10 seconds. I don't normally freeze like that, but it was such a bizarre sight that I literally couldn't wrap my mind around it. I started thinking, could this be some kind of exotic pet escaped from a private owner, or a misidentified bird or something? But there's no way. The movement and body shape was entirely too large and too humanoid. I actually found myself checking the side mirrors and scanning the roadside edges the entire rest of the route, half expecting to see it again, or something else come out of the woods. At the next stop, I tried to tell another driver over the radio, but I ended up saying I thought I saw something, never specifying. I was afraid I'd be laughed right off the radio if I started ranting about a reptilian figure crossing the road. That day I got home around my usual time, somewhere between 4:30 and 5 p.m., after all the afternoon runs. My wife asked me how my day was, and I told her I saw something odd but didn't want to talk about it yet. I think I was still processing. She insisted, so I told her it was some kind of... I didn't even use the word reptilian. I just described it as a lizard-like figure. She said I probably just saw a deer at a weird angle, or maybe a trick of the light. But I'm not that easily spooked by a mere deer, and deer definitely don't have that scaly reflection, or that upright gait. Also, I've confronted deer and elk on the road more times than I can count. None of them move like what I saw. For the next couple of days, every time I pass that specific spot, it's near the intersection where Machias Road hits the main route that leads back to Highway 9. I felt this pang of dread, like I was anticipating seeing it again or not seeing it, both equally unsettling. I even considered pulling over in daylight to see if there was any kind of footprint or disturbed brush, but it's such a busy route for a bus driver in the morning that I opted not to risk being late. Plus, there wasn't a convenient spot to park. The shoulder there is narrow and often muddy, and I worried about getting stuck or just drawing attention to myself. If any of the passing folks saw me kneeling in the brush, they'd probably wonder what was wrong with me. I did talk to a fellow driver I trust, a guy who's been on the job in Snohomish County for about 30 years, and I gave him the full story in that indirect sort of way people do when they're not sure if they're going to be believed. He told me he once thought he saw something similar back in 2002 when he was bus driving for the Monroe School District, also early in the morning. He never told anyone because he just decided it was probably his eyes playing tricks. But when I told him about the scaly sheen, he just fell quiet and suggested that maybe there's more around these parts than we realize. It was a relief that he didn't laugh. He seemed to take it in stride. Even so, we both ended up changing the subject real fast afterward, probably because we didn't want to dwell on it. Now, I went online and tried to look up sightings of strange reptilian beings in Washington state, which is something I never thought I'd do in my entire life. I didn't find a lot of official sources, obviously, but I stumbled on a few mentionings in various corners of the internet that talk about reptilian creatures being spotted in remote forested areas across the Pacific Northwest. Whether there's anything to that, I can't say. I wasn't about to call the police or mention it to the school district, for obvious reasons. Nobody wants to be the bus driver who's telling wild stories and losing credibility. A buddy of mine works part-time at a local feed store on weekends, and I slipped in a vague question about odd critters in the region. He looked at me like I was losing it, and I ended up backing off rather than pushing the conversation. I figured he'd get suspicious or start rumors if I kept pressing, so I just let it go. But the night of that sighting, it burned itself into my memory so deeply that I keep replaying it. I've even had a couple of dreams about it, which is weird. I normally don't remember any dreams. The bus route is still the same though, and I haven't seen anything like that again. I sometimes wonder if it migrated, if it even is a living, breathing thing, or if it was some fluke, or maybe some experimental creature that escaped from a lab. But that's me letting my imagination run away. The weather conditions that day were standard for early December in western Washington. Kind of drizzling, overcast, low 40s. I felt the heater on the bus wasn't working too well, so I was already a bit cranky. Sometimes I think about how none of this would have happened if I'd been driving just 5 or 10 seconds earlier or later. Maybe I'd have missed it, and my life wouldn't have this weird question mark. Part of me even gets anxious about the idea that kids might see it. I don't think it seemed particularly interested in the bus, but who knows? The whole thing was so fast, and yet, at the same time, it felt like slow motion. Like I had enough time to really look at its posture, see the shape of its skull, even notice that the arms seemed longer than an average person's arms. I still drive the same route. It's been months and no second encounter. The only difference is, I consistently have that feeling of scanning the tree line, especially when the sun hasn't come up yet. If I ever see it again, I'll look for a place to pull over and try to get some sense of tracks or something concrete. But I'm not entirely sure I'd want to step outside the bus to investigate. There's a level of caution I can't shake now. Maybe it's a leftover primal fear, because my mind keeps going back to that skin reflection. There was no fur, no feathers, just sequences of what seemed like reptilian scales, shining back at me in the headlights. I might sound completely off my rocker, but to this day, I can't rationalize it away. I've seen deer, elk, coyotes, cougars, and in very rare cases, wolves around these parts. None of those can account for what I encountered. So I'm sending you this in hopes that if anyone else in Washington or anywhere else has come across something like this, they might not feel so alone in their experience. I don't even know where to begin with this, but I've been rattled for days, and I feel like I need to tell someone who might have a different perspective than the folks around here. I live in Wayne County, up along the southern shore of Lake Ontario. Been tending this orchard for a good 20 years or so. The orchard was originally planted back in the 1940s by my grandfather, right between Sodus and Williamson. Pretty well-known apple country if you're from around here. Everything was normal until about 2 weeks ago, and I've been trying to wrap my head around it since. It all started close to midnight. I don't normally wander the orchard that late, but we'd lost power because of a line issue down the road, and I went out to see if the irrigation pump was still operating. We rely on electric timers, and I was worried the system might overwater a section if it kicked back on improperly. The wind was whipping off the lake something fierce that night, even though it was early August. I remember thinking how strange it was that the breeze carried such a sharp chill when it had been hot and muggy all day. I was using one of those big handheld flashlights, the heavy-duty kind that can light up half the orchard if you point it right. But my battery was already half drained, because I basically grabbed it on my way out. I was heading down the main row. Grandpa used to call it the central row, where we keep the Ida Reds and Cortlands. I got about halfway to the pump station and heard this sound that made my skin crawl. It wasn't like a coyote yip or a fox bark. Those are almost eerie but familiar. This was deeper, louder, almost like a distorted wolf howl, but not quite. It reverberated through my chest. I literally felt it, which is insane because there's no record of wolves around here anymore. Not for a long time, and definitely not something that howls like it's got a chest like a grizzly. The moment I heard it, I froze. I swung my flashlight around in a panic, expecting maybe a dog or something big, but I saw nothing, just the rows of apple trees stretching out under the moonlight. I stood there for what felt like forever, listening, but it didn't repeat. Then, just as I was about to keep walking, I heard branches snap in the distance. Could have been a deer, but it sounded heavier, taller, if that makes sense. I tried to rationalize that it might be a buck moving through, especially this time of year when they start to get braver, but my gut told me something else was out there. Anyway, I reached the little pump shack, and that's when the hair on my neck rose up again. The shack door was slightly ajar, and we usually keep it padlocked because we store fungicides and stuff in there. Nothing particularly hazardous, but you don't want some kid wandering in. The lock wasn't broken, just gone, and the door had these gashes on it, 4 lines in a row, each about 6 inches long, spaced almost like claw marks. I thought maybe someone had pried it open with a crowbar and did a sloppy job, but these marks were too curved, too irregular, more like something alive had done it. At this point, I started thinking maybe it was a bear, but black bears don't usually wander into the orchard from this area. Further south in the Finger Lakes maybe. Up near the Adirondacks, definitely. But right here, next to Lake Ontario, rare, but not impossible. My mind was scrambling for an explanation. I looked inside the shack. Nothing amiss. Just the usual supplies and the water pump. The fuses were still intact, so the power issue must have been from the main line, not in here. I pulled the door shut and stuck a spare lock on it that we keep in the workshop. Then I started walking back, and that's when I heard the howl again, even louder, almost directly behind me. I spun around so fast I nearly dropped the flashlight. This time it was accompanied by a rustling in the trees. I swear I could make out a silhouette standing upright, like not on 4 legs, maybe 30 or 40 feet away. It was tall, broad in the shoulders, but the shapes around it were so dark I couldn't see clear details. As soon as I tried to shine the light on it, it darted to the right, behind a thick trunk. The entire orchard row was trembling with movement. It was absolute terror. I mean, I've seen deer bolt, I've seen coyote packs, but this was different. It moved in a quick, almost bounding way, and it seemed bipedal. It's still messing with my head. I practically ran back to my house. The next morning, I woke up at first light and went out to inspect the area. I found more of those scratch marks on the lower branches of a few trees, like something had reached up or maybe even jumped and raked the bark. And some of the apple clusters were torn right off, half eaten. I'm not talking about typical deer bites or smaller rips. It was as though something huge just grabbed entire bunches of apples in a single swipe. I know this orchard like the back of my hand, and I've never seen damage done like that before. If it was a bear, you'd see bigger prints, though I did find some weird impressions in the softer ground near the ditch. It almost looked like a large canine print, but elongated. The claws were spaced further than normal dog prints, more like a thick, wide paw, or maybe a hand. I honestly don't even know how to describe it. I ended up calling a buddy of mine who works over at the Cornell Cooperative Extension in Newark, just to inquire about local wildlife sightings. He mentioned that, occasionally, big coyotes or coy dogs roam through, but the size of these marks doesn't fit that. He said he hadn't heard of a black bear sighting in our area for a while, let alone something that'd carve up an orchard. During that call, I couldn't bring myself to mention how I'd seen that shape that looked bipedal. I know he'd write me off as losing it. This orchard is my livelihood, and some people already think orchard folks can be a bit eccentric. I tried to put it out of my mind for a few days. I'm the type that likes to come up with a rational explanation, you know? But then, 3 nights after the first incident, I woke up around 3 a.m. to my border collie whining at the back door. She's antsy sometimes, especially if a raccoon's in the yard, but this was a different whine, like she was truly scared. I opened the door just a crack to look out, and I caught a glimpse of something moving near the old barn we use for storage. It was tall again, with what looked like pointed ears on top of its head, and it moved like it was hunched forward but on 2 legs. The reflection of its eyes in the moonlight was a yellowish glow. I just shut the door and locked it. I didn't feel safe trying to chase it off. I can't believe I'm actually writing this down, but it felt like something out of a nightmare, or some story you'd hear about so-called dogman sightings. It's so surreal to even type that word, but there it is. In the morning, I ventured back out with my truck and circled the orchard's perimeter, found more partial prints near the barn, some fresh scratches on the exterior wood siding, and a bunch of scattered apples on the ground like they'd been thrown around. Whatever is coming through my orchard is still out there, though the sightings and the howls have slowed down this past week. I stay alert every evening now, scanning the tree lines with a spotlight, sometimes carrying my grandfather's old lever-action rifle, though I don't know if that would help, and frankly, I hope I never have to find out. I've read local news stories from time to time about folks in the Adirondacks, claiming they saw a large, wolf-like creature walking on two legs. I used to laugh those off, thinking they were just spooked by a bear or a weird angle in the darkness. But now, having heard those howls so close, feeling that force in my chest, and seeing these claw marks, I'm not so sure. It kills me that I can't just chalk it up to some known animal. Something is very off. And so I turn to you with this account, hoping maybe someone else has mentioned similar experiences in upstate New York. Because if I hadn't lived it, I wouldn't believe a word of it myself. I've been volunteering up at the Wyoming Infrared Observatory on Gel Mountain for about 4 months now, mostly just helping catalog older documentation and scanning decades worth of images so they're properly archived. It's quiet, aside from the usual hum of the equipment and the wind that never seems to stop. I figured I'd enjoy the solitude, because I'm usually happiest buried in old records or tinkering around with the instruments when the team is out. The University of Wyoming runs the place, and it's been around since the late 1970s, so there's a lot to go through. Anyway, the higher-ups asked me to sort through these old 35mm slides and large format negatives that had been stashed in a metal cabinet near the back of a storage room. I think some date back to the early 1980s. Most of them are mundane. Images of star fields, calibration tests for the telescopes, time-lapse sequences. But in one of the unmarked boxes, there were maybe a dozen black and white photographs that had absolutely nothing to do with the night sky. They looked more like terrain shots, wooded areas, rock formations, vantage points possibly from near the base of the mountain. I'm not even sure who took them, since they weren't labeled or had any official stamps like the rest. At first, I thought they were just random scenic photos somebody took during downtime. But the deeper I looked, the more I noticed some weird silhouettes in 2 of the frames. They're not crystal clear. These are older photos. Might have just been taken on a personal camera by a staff member or something. But you can see these large, upright figures out on a slope where there's a patch of pine trees. I honestly assumed it was just a person when I first caught sight, but the proportions are really off. The arms seem too long, and there's this bulky, hunched-over posture that you can't miss once you notice it. I got a bit carried away trying to enhance the images with the software we have here, though that's not exactly my official task. I was just curious, and sometimes the nights can be long and boring if the sky conditions aren't good for observation. When I zoom in, you can see what looks like hair texture, or at least a fuzzy outline. It reminds me of certain Bigfoot images that I've come across on random forums, except these are older and look more authentic somehow. Maybe because there's zero hint of them being staged or part of a hoax. They're just stuck in a pile with other mundane pictures. If somebody was trying to pull a prank, I doubt they'd have kept them locked away in an unlabeled folder for so many decades. The environment in the photos resembles the forested areas you'd find on the north side of Gel Mountain, which is a bit odd because the most commonly accessed vantage points are on the southwestern side, if I recall correctly. There's a footpath that goes around near this old service route, but it's not part of the usual staff routine, unless we're doing maintenance on some external equipment. I did a bit of checking in the station's older maintenance logs to see if there was any mention of unusual sightings or security concerns, and I found a couple of dated entries, one from August 1981, another from May 1983, where staff apparently reported large animals seen at dawn near the base of the mountain. No specific details, though. It could be anything from a bear wandering around to a moose, but that doesn't quite line up with the shapes in the photos. One of the photos is especially intriguing because there appear to be 2 figures side by side, almost like they're walking in tandem across a narrow clearing. Their stride looks strange. One leg seems to extend far forward as though it's covering a lot of ground. Each figure appears to be at least a head taller than an average man. If those pines in the background are around 30 feet tall, a guess from experience, I'm not an arborist, but I know pine sizes around here, then these figures might be pushing 8 or 9 feet. That's speculation, but there's a scale to it that's hard to dismiss. While I was immersed in this, I went down a rabbit hole of local folklore around this region. I found out that a handful of Bigfoot sighting reports have popped up in southeast Wyoming over the years. Less so than in the Pacific Northwest, but still. A friend of mine from Laramie said his grandfather once swore he'd seen something big and upright forging through deep snow near the Medicine Bow National Forest in the early 70s. It's always these secondhand stories, and you never get a real sense of what's true and what's local legend. But these photos lend a shred of credibility, at least personally. Something else I noticed is the date on the film packaging. One of them had a sticker from a camera store that used to exist in downtown Laramie, long since closed, I think. They apparently developed the pictures in June 1982, because there's a stamp with that month and year. It lines up with one of those odd maintenance log entries I mentioned, though it's not an exact match. One was from May, the pictures are from June. Still, it's close. It makes me think whoever took them might have tried to keep it under wraps, or maybe they were just too busy with official work to bother publicizing it. Back then, the staff would have been fairly small, mostly astrophysics grad students and visiting professors. I'm not sure how a revelation like that would have been handled. Maybe they thought it would attract too much unwanted attention to the observatory. It's really something, though, seeing those silhouettes and the possibility that these images have been sitting in a dusty cabinet for decades, never shared publicly. Part of me wants to do a thorough search of the grounds, especially the lower areas that aren't frequently patrolled or visited. But the weather can be unpredictable, and we're at over 960 feet, so it's not exactly an easy trek during certain seasons. I'm also just a volunteer, so I can't exactly barge into the director's office demanding an official Bigfoot hunt. Still, I can't shake the feeling there's more of this hidden somewhere. Maybe in some of the older journaling logs or personal diaries from the staff members who lived on site. People used to spend extended periods at the back dormitory here, if they were running multi-night observation sessions. Who knows what they might have encountered late at night, especially in the winter months when it's brutally cold and dead silent outside. One of the engineers passing by told me something about hearing strange howls one night, but that's just hearsay, and apparently it happened a long time ago. I've debated whether to bring this up with my supervisor, but I don't want to risk them thinking I'm not taking my actual responsibilities seriously. Meanwhile, I've got these enhanced digital copies, and they definitely show large, upright, ape-like figures. I'm fairly certain these are not just illusions or weird shadows. Could be someone in a suit, but then why stash them away with no mention for all these years? It doesn't make much sense. I don't really know where to start, so I'll just jump in. I was stationed at the Little North Mountain Lookout Tower. Well, it's not actually called that. That's just what some of us volunteers have dubbed it, because you can see clear across the ridges to the northern slopes of Mendocino National Forest. I was assigned there after some of the biggest burns they've had in that region. I was doing my usual rounds, scanning for persistent embers or hot spots that might flare up again. At this time of year, with the wind picking up in the late afternoons, you can never be too careful. I remember it was early October last year, right in the tail end of what they were calling the August Complex Fire Zone, when the smoke was somewhat cleared, but the sky still had that weird washed-out grayish tint to it. The ground was still blackened in places, and if you walked along certain ridges, you'd kick up more ash than dust. I'd been out there all day checking little stumps that can smolder for weeks, and I was tired, probably dehydrated, and ready to call it a night. I noticed something off to the west side of a burned-over clearing. It was about 5:30 in the evening, maybe a bit later, because I recall the sky starting to dim. People always say the forest goes quiet when something strange is around. I don't know how true that is usually, but I remember standing there and noticing not a single bird, bug, or any other sound. Just dead silence, which was odd for that time of day, because usually the insects start up, and you'd hear at least one bird chirping. It was so still. I started looking more carefully among the scattered trunks and burned logs. I saw a shape that first I thought was just a snag, a dead tree trunk, but something looked wrong about it. It was too tall and too skinny to be a downed trunk, and it wasn't the right color either. dark, but with almost a whitish or grayish tone around the face area. At first, I thought maybe it was a mountain lion or a coyote or something, but it was standing upright. Hard to gauge the exact height from where I was, but it looked at least 7 feet tall, maybe more, because it loomed over a charred pine stump I know stands about chest high to me, and I'm 6 foot. I started walking a little closer, carefully, because I thought it might be a person, though no one had any business being out there. I mean, it's a closed area, and we get these occasional trespassers who want to see the burn scars, or sometimes they're searching for salvageable wood. I started to speak out, something along the lines of how the area's off limits. But then I stopped. It moved in this strange, jerky way, like a starving animal, and its limbs seemed too long, like the arms went down closer to the knees than a normal human. My breath caught in my chest because it turned its head, slowly, almost like it was rotating it further than you'd think a neck should go. And though the smokiness in the air made it hard to see details, I could pick up on these eye sockets that seemed bigger than normal. I remember being so creeped out by how still it was. It wasn't looking at me directly, but it was scanning around like it was searching for something. I sort of froze for a moment. My radio was clipped to my belt, and I quietly unfastened it, thinking about calling in. But I also just didn't want to make any noise. Around that time, one of the other volunteers was probably half a ridge away, out of direct earshot for sure. I don't recall any direct words, but in my mind I was just going, what in the world am I seeing? I'd heard stories from old-timers about weird creatures in the woodlands. Most folks from around here mentioned Bigfoot sightings. But this was something else, something more emaciated and unnatural, almost like the color of a desiccated corpse, if that makes any sense. Now let me make a weird aside. I'd spent a bit of time with some folks in the Hoopa Valley area, hearing legends and such. A lot of them talked about malevolent spirits that roam after big tragedies, or when the land's been hurt. In passing conversation, I heard the term Wendigo, though that was always tied more to cold northern territories. But maybe the concept drifts. I'm not claiming that's definitely what I saw, but I sure wasn't thinking Bigfoot. This thing had an unsettling aura, and it stood near that line of burnt trees, like it was surveying the damage or maybe waiting for something. I couldn't see horns or antlers, but the shape of its head was somewhat elongated, or maybe it was just the heavy shadows from the burned-out trunks behind it. I must have stood there for a good minute or two, although it's hard to tell exactly how long when your adrenaline spikes. I was worried about my route back, because I needed to traverse the same direction where it was standing. I started stepping back, trying not to break any charred branches under my boots. Then I noticed the stench, like decaying meat, but not fresh, more like something rotting in the sun for a week. At first I thought it might just be a dead deer, or something left behind, which does happen, but that smell rolled in very suddenly, and it was unbelievably foul. I backed up maybe 10 or 15 paces, and it just turned, walked away in this slow, cautious shuffle behind a stand of blackened fir trees, kind of half hunched over. When I felt sure it was out of sight, I practically sprinted back to my truck, which was parked a few hundred yards down the slope on a rough fire road. I honestly expected it to jump out at me at any moment. My mind was racing with memories of older stories I'd heard about watchers in the forest, who come when there's been devastation. One older volunteer told me something about how certain beings are drawn to the scars of major wildfires. At the time, I chalked it up to tall tales. Back at the truck, I just sat there for a good 15 minutes with the engine running, the doors locked, feeling paranoid as all get out. Big part of me wanted to radio the Forest Service main station, but I already know that's the kind of thing that'll get you labeled a sighting crank or something. Plus, the area was very hush-hush, because some parts of those wildfire zones were still under investigation for possible remaining hazards. Eventually, I decided to drive back to the main volunteer station near Elk Creek. I didn't see anything else on the way, but I kept checking the rearview mirror. I've been trying to figure out what to do about this ever since. It might sound crazy, but I felt like, if there's something like that out there, maybe it's best I let you know. I'm not saying I've got some ironclad proof. I didn't get pictures. I was too busy thinking about getting out of there. But I can't shake the way it felt to look at that thing. and feel like it was something more than an animal, more than a person. The land itself felt different, like the silence had its own weight. I haven't really spoken about it with many people. There's a lot of superstitious folks around here, and they might think I'm making it up or losing it from the stress of these fires. I've been stationed in this old Cold War-era bunker near Colorado Springs for almost 6 months now, assigned as a sort of caretaker, and occasionally a glorified tour guide for visiting officials who need to rummage through archive materials. It's not officially on the books as far as I can tell, though I'm sure there's a dusty reference somewhere. The facility is tucked off a winding mountain road not too far from the Cheyenne Mountain Complex, but I don't want to give too many specifics because I'm still technically under contract. I never thought much about the purpose of this place when I started. I assumed it was all about old intel on Soviet threats, maybe some leftover doomsday preparations. Typical subterranean hush-hush stuff I was told they'd use during the latter part of the 20th century. I'd been here a couple of months, doing routine checks on the ventilation system and ensuring the backup generators were in order, when I noticed there was a section behind a locked door near the main records room that I'd never seen open. It looked vulnerable in a sense, like there had been a new lock installed over a much older mechanism. One day, an older gentleman in a wrinkled suit came through, rummaged around for a while in the main archives, and walked past that locked door with a set of keys. He paused for a minute before letting himself in. When he came back out, I caught a glimpse of some overly thick, battered manila folders, way too large for routine government paperwork. After he left, I couldn't stop wondering what that room actually contained. It ate at me for days, because the only reason to keep something locked away in a place that's already heavily restricted is if you're guarding something the public absolutely can't see. Normally, I mind my own business, but the thing about staying so many hours underground, especially at night, is that curiosity nags at you. It's bedrock silence broken only by the humming of the fluorescent lights and the faint echo of your own footsteps. Eventually, I scrounged up the nerve to check the logs in the caretaker's office, hoping to see who had permission for that locked room. The logs were half burned in places. There was a small incident with a space heater back in 2015, according to a scribbled note I found. A few pages still had legible bits, references to cryptid research, sample retrieval, and declassified sections BF data. I thought BF might have referred to Black File, but it didn't quite line up with other references to black projects I'd seen. Later on, I realized it could stand for something else. My dad used to talk about wild men, or ape men, up in the Sangre de Cristo range when he was a park ranger decades ago. I dismissed his stories as just that, folklore. But for some reason, seeing these references to BF data sparked a memory of one of his rants about how government agencies hush up certain creature sightings. He insisted that certain parks had restricted areas not just to protect wildlife, but to protect the public from seeing things we're not supposed to. He never specifically said Bigfoot, but the implication was there. A few weeks after that initial discovery, I was on a routine maintenance sweep when an overhead light flickered and died near that same door. It's just down a short corridor that leads to these older offices with sealed filing cabinets. I was trying to fix the fixture when I noticed the door wasn't properly latched. Probably the gentleman in the wrinkled suit forgot to double lock it. I swear I hesitated forever, heart pounding, wondering if I could lose my job, or worse, if I was caught snooping. Inside, the room was no bigger than a standard closet, lined with shelves of ring binders and random archival boxes stacked haphazardly. The dust was thick enough to choke you. There was a single overhead bulb with a pull chain, giving everything that eerie dungeon vibe. The first file I pulled out had Project Evergreen stamped on the cover. It contained a stack of black and white photos of large footprints in the snow, listed from various Colorado mountain passes. Wolf Creek Pass, 1982. Monarch Pass, 1986. Independence Pass, early 1990s. Accompanying type pages describe sightings of massive upright creatures that left behind footprints measuring over 16 inches in length. Some documents had official U.S. Forest Service letterheads that looked real, old addresses, everything. There were requests for investigation, references to National Guard involvement, and at least one mention of a formal order of silence from a high-level official. I couldn't believe it. This was real documentation, not rumor or hearsay. Another binder had sightings mapped across Rocky Mountain National Park, complete with Polaroids of hair samples and plaster casts that were kept somewhere else, maybe in some climate-controlled vault. One text excerpt read something like, "We are under strict directives to maintain public safety by denying any official knowledge of these hominid subjects." Then a second paragraph alluded to how certain political figures had arranged discrete evidence transfers to labs in Denver. It never explicitly said Bigfoot, but by that point it was obvious. Large, hairy, bipedal creatures in the remote forests. I even found references to expedited field retrieval teams that were used to contain any potential contact events, meaning if hikers or campers had close encounters or even photographic evidence, these teams would intercept them. It blew my mind because it hinted at standard operating procedures for seizing and classifying anything that might come out in the open. And that got me thinking about all the times I'd heard from local folks about mysteriously disappearing photos or men in suits who show up unannounced when people claim to have physical evidence of Bigfoot. I used to dismiss those as typical tinfoil hat theories. What really stood out was one folder labeled Emergency Protocol, Quadruple Transition. It detailed how these creatures could move on all fours, just as adeptly as they move on two legs, contributing to many mistaken sightings over the years. Some bullets made mention of what the official response should be in the event a creature was captured or killed. Another part described unusual eye shine, potential intelligence levels, and speculation about how these beings could mimic certain vocal sounds, which might explain stories of them imitating human voices. My own mind drifted back to a conversation I overheard in a bar near Fort Carson, where an off-duty soldier mentioned something about unofficial training exercises in the mountains against unconventional threats. You hear things, but you chalk it up to barstool bravado, you know. I got so wrapped up reading that I didn't notice how much time had passed. My phone buzzed, an alarm I set to remind myself to check the generator systems. Realizing I needed to lock this place up again, I tucked the files back exactly as I found them. My hands were shaking. I felt almost nauseous. It's one thing to suspect something or to read random reports on conspiracy forums, but to see official documents, that's different. It chilled me to the bone. Over the next couple of days, I started noticing random surveillance checks that seemed out of the ordinary. A pair of suits, different from the older guy in the wrinkled suit. These two were younger, more rigid, came around, claiming they were updating the inventorial logs. They lingered near the caretaker's office, flipping through old sign-in sheets. Indirectly, I heard them say that they were verifying compliance with security protocols. Nothing about Bigfoot, obviously, but I got the sense they were looking for anything suspicious, like they knew someone had gotten in there. I played dumb, said I was just the guy who does the mechanical rounds, which is pretty close to the truth anyway. I haven't dared bring it up with my direct supervisor because she's ex-Air Force and very by the book. She'd probably either report me or cut me off mid-sentence if I tried to mention it. Yet I can't stop thinking about how deep this goes. It's not just some random local folklore pinned in a basement. There were references to branches of the military, the Department of the Interior, and cross-collaboration with private research labs. Some pages even hinted at sightings outside Colorado, places like Mount Rainier in Washington, the Sierra Nevadas in California, and remote areas of Alaska. But Colorado seemed to be a hotbed, especially in the southwestern region near the San Juans. I'm honestly freaked out. It makes me question every weird story I've ever come across. My dad's old tales don't sound so crazy anymore. The fact that we've been systematically fed a narrative of these beings as hoaxes or illusions, it's borderline infuriating now that I've seen the massive paper trail. And it's not just fuzzy pictures of footprints. There's worn-out hair samples, detailed anatomical sketches, and typed reports from high-level agencies that treat these creatures as an undisputed reality. The term cover-up feels almost inadequate. I'm passing this on to you because your YouTube channel has covered similar whistleblower accounts. I figure if I ever vanish under questionable circumstances, at least someone will have a clue why. I'm not trying to stir up trouble. I just can't sit on this information without sharing it. I can't exactly mail these documents off to you without risking major blowback. So for now, consider this a heads up that what people have been suspecting for decades, it's real. The footprints, the sightings, the seemingly orchestrated denial. The government knows, and they've known for a very, very long time. I'm the medic on record for Deep Trident, a semi-submersible drilling platform parked 130 nautical miles south of Port Fourchon, Louisiana. My log says the event started at 2300 hours on June 18, 2021. If anybody higher up reads this, just know I've changed some of the details. My shift that night began at 1800 hours. Standard 12 on, 12 off rotation, 6 p.m. to 6 a.m. First couple of hours were the usual. Blood pressure checks for roughnecks heading to the drill floor, 2 small lacerations from slips on greased grating, 1 case of reflux. By 22:30, the clinic was quiet enough for me to start inventory. That's when the intercom crackled with a voice I knew, deckhand Marco Cruz shouting, "Doc, you seeing this? Got lights under the water, starboard midship." Crew superstition runs deep. I figured they were just bored and messing with the new steward. Still, platform rules say any report of unusual sighting goes to the medic for initial check, so I locked the crash cart, grabbed my radio, and headed outside. Humidity hit like hot soup. The Gulf smelled of diesel, salt, and warm algae. 3 deckhands leaned over the starboard rail, pointing straight down. The sea was black velvet except for curling streaks of pale green, thin, slow-moving lines about 20 yards out. Marco swore it wasn't plankton. He'd seen plankton plenty. These lights looked almost like thin, flexible tubes dancing just below surface chop. 30 seconds later, the streaks pulled into one bright mass, lit up like someone cracked a giant glow stick under the rig. Then the glow vanished. We logged it, filed under possible bioluminescent organism. I told them go back to work. That should have been the end. At 0:45, crane operator Gina called the bridge yelling we had a man overboard port side. The official term is Code Oscar. Bridge sounded the klaxon. Floodlights lit the water. Nobody counted heads yet. The roster board still showed all green tags. I grabbed oxygen, trauma kit, and the handheld thermal imager and sprinted aft. Wind gusted maybe 20 knots, enough to flick spray over the catwalks. The rescue cage, a steel basket we lower on a winch, was already rigged on the boat landing. Normally I'd search with the fast rescue craft, but seas were 4 to 6 feet. The cage would have to do. We swung it out and down. The surface boiled brighter this time. Same green glow, pulsing inside whitewater. Gina muttered, "That's no life vest." We dipped the cage. Light swirled around it. Winch operator Steve counted off 10 seconds and brought it up. Water streamed through the mesh floor. Something heavy thumped inside. At first, all I saw was rope, then realized it was a coil of our own seismic cable tangled around. A body? But the body glowed like a firefly, every outline flickering sea green. I leaned in. Skin, yes, but translucent. Faint ribs under the glow. Gill slits fluttering near the collarbones. Arms jointed like ours but longer. Hands webbed to mid-finger. No clothes, just torn cable sleeves looped round its waist like kelp. Steve froze. Marco backed up, crossed himself. Training says secure casualty first. I clipped a line to the cage, hopped in, and checked for vitals. A pulse hammered under the neck slits, fast, maybe 200 beats a minute. I couldn't find a nose, only narrow vents beside flat nostrils. I pressed my stethoscope where a heart should be. Instead of a normal heartbeat, I heard a flutter, like a hummingbird on overdrive. We had no protocol for glowing fish people, so I defaulted to human trauma. I cut the cables binding its chest, lifted the torso, felt cartilage, not bone. The glow dimmed, eyelids flicked open, black pupils wide. It focused on my face, then on the overhead floodlight. A low whistle escaped its mouth. Whistle might be wrong. More like a bottlenose dolphin chirp, short and sharp. The sound hit my chest, and I swear I felt it rather than heard it. I radioed the tool pusher, told him to clear the mess hall and prep it as quarantine. We needed fresh water, heat lamps off, and every curious roughneck out. He cursed but complied. We rolled the cage to the cargo bay and lifted the creature onto a tarp. The glow had dimmed to faint pinpoints across its shoulders. Skin felt slick, not scaly, closer to a salamander. I tagged the case as Respiratory Unknown A and started oxygen. The chest expanded easier. Gill vents drew water we dribbled from a spray hose and expelled clear fluid that smelled of brine. Soon, a helicopter bearing the company logo appeared from the north and winched 3 passengers onto the pad. 2 men, 1 woman, no personal flotation devices, just black windbreakers marked Econ, short for environmental consultant. We get these suits whenever a spill happens. They walk straight to the clinic without IDs, flashing laminated cards that said, Level 5 clearance. We don't have levels on the rig, so that was just theater. Lead consultant, guy named Rourke, asked how many of us had direct contact. I raised my hand. So did 5 others. He separated us from the rest, ordered everyone else to muster in the galley, and told radio room to lock external channels. He called it a Category Delta encounter. Corporate handbook has no Delta. Rourke wrote our names on a legal pad, then confiscated phones, even analog watches, said magnetic fields could disrupt decontamination sensors. Sensors that never materialized. He stepped into the makeshift ward. The creature lay curled on damp towels under dimmed lights, chest moving slow. Rourke's team carried a handheld scanner, waving it like an airport wand. It beeped faster over the gills, slower at the limbs. The woman consultant whispered readings. Rourke nodded, said, "Viable specimen." He looked at me. "You administered oxygen?" I said yes. He nodded again, like approving a shop report. Alarms blared in engine control. Generator 3 was offline. Load transfer was failing. That shouldn't happen in calm weather. Chief engineer radioed that the lube oil coolers flooded. Motors tripped. We dropped 2,000 barrels per hour production. Drilling paused. Tool pusher yelled storms on radar, but the horizon was clear. While the crew scrambled, I returned to the ward. The creature was awake, propped on elbows. Its pupils now vertical slits. It tracked the airflow vent overhead, chirped twice, and swung its legs off the stretcher. I tried soft voice reassurance. It mimicked the pitch, almost mocking. Then it pushed onto its feet, 7 feet tall easy, but weighed maybe 160 tops. Limbs all lean tendon. It walked toward the nearest water source, the eye wash station. I turned the handle. Green lights flared under its skin where the water hit. It cupped its hands, drank, then pressed both palms against the stainless counter. When it lifted away, sucker-like rings left faint suction marks on the steel. Rourke barreled in with 2 consultants carrying a broad nylon sling. He ordered, "Sedate it." I said we had no idea what drugs were safe. He produced a vial and a syringe that was pre-drawn with a murky liquid. I refused, citing license liability. He said corporate indemnity covered it. I still refused. The creature watched us argue, head tilting, glow shifting blue around its neck. Then the floor vibrated, a dull boom from the drill deck. Overpressure alarms screamed. Rourke swore and told his team to get the specimen below. Smoke curled up the stairwell. I ran for the deck. Hydraulic lines on the top drive had ruptured, spraying fluid that ignited on hot metal. Flames licked the derrick. Automatic suppression kicked in, but control valves had been manually closed. Someone had sabotaged fire loops. The captain yelled weatherfront, sudden swell, but the sea still looked like dark glass. Over the radio, crane operator Gina swore she saw glowing shapes weaving among the support columns under the rig, slicing hoses with flicks of webbed claws. cameras showed nothing. Video feeds cut to snow, then blank. By 03:30, we had the fire under control. Production was 0. Generators 1 and 2 ran partial. 3 stayed dead. Corporate chopper circled overhead with sling net hanging. Rourke signaled his team. They wheeled the creature, now bound in the nylon sling but unsedated, onto the helideck. Wind thrashed the sling. The creature whistled a low, mournful note, skin pulsing electric blue. It met my eyes. Just raw question under panic. Chopper winch hooked the sling and hauled up. No stretcher, no insulation. Straight into the rotor wash. Blue glow flickered like a lightning bug in a jar. Then they were gone northbound. Rotor lights fading in the night. At 04:10, Rourke debriefed the master. He called the equipment failures storm impact. Ordered us to write identical log entries citing unexpected squall damage. Every roughneck knew it was a lie, but no one argued. Offshore survival often means nodding and cashing the check. They lifted off at 04:35, leaving us with crippled machinery and a thick stack of non-disclosure forms. We limped through the rest of the shift patching hoses and resetting breakers. The captain radioed shore for replacement parts. Shore said weather windows closed until evening. Another convenient delay. Just before dawn, I stepped onto the catwalk for a smoke I shouldn't have. First light barely touched the horizon. Down by column 7, in the faint green reflection of deck floodlights, I saw 3 shapes pacing the waterline. Tall, sleek, each carrying its own halo of glow. They moved together, circling the swims lines that anchor the ballast tanks. One paused, looked up. I swear the glow around its eyes brightened like a camera flash. I dropped the cigarette. By the time it hit the grate, the shapes were gone. Water calm as a pond. I went back to the clinic, logged everything under personal observations. The company server bounced the file as corrupted. I printed a hard copy, sealed it in a specimen bag, and taped it behind the oxygen manifold, where only I know to look. If this hits the wrong eyes, they'll call it hallucination from fatigue. But ask any hand who stood the night tour on June 18th. Everyone keeps sneaking glances over the rail when the lights dim, waiting to see that impossible green flicker come back. Machinery acts up more often now. Cables found sliced, yet storms stay clear. Official reports still blame weather. That's the record. If the Gulf glows again, remember, some things from beneath don't want our help. They just want their own back, and they know how to cut us loose. Did anyone else try? Just remember this. If your rig breaks down in the Manistee National Forest after dark, and you hear 2-legged footsteps circling, stay inside, keep the engine running if you can, and be wary of polite men who arrive with gift cards and paperwork that already says bear. Something else is out there, and someone in authority knows it. Maybe telling this will let me sleep. If not, at least the story is no longer locked in my head. I'm the overnight security guard at the old Ohio State Reformatory in Mansfield, the one they used for that famous movie years ago. You might already know how it closed down officially back in 1990, but part of the structure is still used for historical tours during the day. After hours, though, it's supposed to be locked down tight, and I'm the one who makes sure no one breaks in. No tourist has any business there at night, and usually it's all quiet. The building just creaks in the cold wind. But that day, or should I say that night, was anything but normal. The shift started at 10 p.m., same as always. I'd gotten used to the routine. Turn on the monitors, do a walkthrough with my flashlight, double check if the basement gates are locked, and periodically circle around to make sure no one snuck in. The entire place is loaded with weird stories, some of which you can read about in leftover staff logs from the 70s or 80s. One ex-guard apparently wrote that he saw lights flickering in the old infirmary corridor upstairs. I never put much stock into ghost stories, though I'd heard enough from a few of the day security folks who swear up and down that they've seen bizarre shapes moving at the end of dusty hallways that are supposed to be empty. Usually I just chalk it up to drafts, old wiring, or my eyes adjusting. But I can't ignore what I experienced the other night. I'd done my third walkthrough around 2:30 a.m. Normally, I don't feel uneasy because these corridors have become something like a second home, as odd as that sounds. But I got this strange urge to linger near cell block B, a long, dingy hallway with peeling paint flaking off the iron bars. You can still see tattered blankets in some cells, left behind from who knows when. Parts of the block are barred off to the public, but I have the passkeys to drop in any time. So that's exactly what I did. I stepped inside the far corridor, and it smelled musty, like wet stone and old dust. Worse than usual. It was so silent, you could almost hear your own heart pounding. Suddenly, I heard what I can only describe as a raspy voice, echoing from the far end. At first, I thought maybe one of the local kids had broken in and was trying to prank me. Some people around here do that for a thrill. The voice sounded like an older man complaining about the cold, but something about the tone made me freeze. It had this hollow ring to it, almost like a mocking impression. I stood there shining my flashlight, fully expecting to see someone pop out from behind the bars. The beam just fell on rusted metal and chipped concrete walls. No sign of movement, yet the voice kept going, weirdly repeating the same phrase, something about "let me out," but repeating it like a broken record. It took me a moment to realize that this voice matched one I'd heard on an old archival recording they sometimes play for visitors in the museum wing, an actual recording of an inmate from decades ago. I remembered the cadence, the way it trailed off. Only difference was that it sounded distorted, as if something was imitating it. The hair on my arm stood up. Then it got quiet. I mentally told myself it was just my imagination, or maybe an echo in these old corridors. I decided to step closer, which is usually the last thing a normal person would do, but I wanted to be sure. I passed 2 or 3 rows of cells. My flashlight caught glimpses of rotted mattresses still lying in some. Then I heard footsteps behind me, not in front, but directly behind, close enough that I jerked around, expecting to see a coworker. There was nothing there except maybe a flicker of movement, a shadow that slipped out of the open hallway. So I followed, my heart practically hammering in my chest. I know that corridor well, since it leads straight down to the chapel area used for storage. By the time I reached the chapel door, it was ajar. That's never supposed to be open after hours, because the day staff is meticulous about locking it. I pushed it open wider and stepped in. The overhead lights are always off because they kill most of the building's power at midnight, so it was almost pitch black save for my flashlight slicing across the dusty floor. That's when I saw, or at least I think I saw, this shape that looked vaguely human crouched in the corner. It was definitely not a reflection. I tried to rationalize that maybe it was a leftover mannequin from the tours, but we don't have mannequins that look like that. This figure kind of rose up in a way that was too smooth, like it wasn't using muscles but just flowing up. Then it seemed to shift in outline, as if parts of it were swirling inside the shape of a person. It was like watching some weird mass pulling into itself to form arms, shoulders, a head. And the voice started again, only this time it sounded like a different person, like a younger inmate. I'd come across a newspaper article from around 1965 about an inmate named Frankie who was known to sing old doo-wop tunes. The voice was using that same melodic hum. At that point, I just stared, because I nearly dropped the flashlight out of pure shock. The figure's outline got fuzzier, then snapped into a shape that looked heavily like a man in a prison uniform. But the face was all wrong. Dark holes for eyes, and something that might have been a mouth but without any real definition. And it was humming that old tune. I heard it as plain as day, though it was not at all melodic. It was more like an imitation that tried to approximate the sound, but missed the soul behind it. I don't even know how long I remained there before it started stepping toward me. I kept backing up, my soul squeaking on the dusty floor. My instincts screamed at me to get out. I didn't turn my back on it, though. I know that was the smartest move I made all night, holding the beam of light on it while I exited. It kept coming forward, making that weird humming. Each step was too slow, too deliberate, as if it was figuring out how to walk bipedally. Then it just stopped, and the humming shifted to a low, almost mocking laugh. I can only call it a laugh because of the rhythm. I bolted out of the chapel room, swung that old wood door shut, threw the deadbolt, and stumbled back into the corridor. Honestly, after I caught my breath, every explanation from maybe I hallucinated it to some elaborate prank zipped through my mind. But who would pull such a stunt at 2:30 in the morning inside the locked portion of an abandoned prison? And how would they even replicate that morphing shape? I eventually forced myself to do another pass, just to confirm no one was actually in the building. I found no signs of any break-in. All doors still locked. No fresh footprints except my own. One of the weirdest things is that the door to the chapel area was locked again when I circled back an hour later. I hadn't relocked it in my frantic retreat. I only slammed it shut. But the key needed to lock it from the outside was still in my pocket, so there's no reason it should have been securely latched. That's when the reality sank in that I'd experienced something I can't begin to unravel in a logical manner. I ended up scouring through some older staff reports before my shift ended at 6 a.m. Found a few references to voices in the cell blocks, mostly ghost stuff that visitors claim they heard during tours, but nothing specifically about a shape that could copy different inmates' voices. When morning came, I told one of my coworkers that I'd heard noises in cell block B and the chapel area. He just gave me that look, saying he'd heard rumors about something that's not exactly a ghost wandering those old halls. Some staff call it a shapeshifter or a mimic, but they usually brush it off as just stories to scare new hires. Now I don't know what to think, only that I'm not quite so eager to check out unusual noises on my own again. I wanted to tell you about something I saw a few weeks ago, up near Grandfather Mountain, that still has me completely rattled. I've been a paragliding instructor here in the high country for close to 10 years now. I typically launch from a spot off the Blue Ridge Parkway near Linville, especially on days when the wind is predictably steady. The weekend in question was the first Saturday in August. It was warmer than usual for that elevation, maybe mid-70s by the midday sun, and the thermals were popping all around the ridges as we were setting up around noon. I'd brought 3 students out for an introductory ridge soaring lesson, something I only do when conditions are calmer, but we had a consistent 6 to 9 miles per hour wind rolling up the slope. It was just enough to keep us afloat close to the ridgeline without pushing us too far out into the valley. The sky was that intense Carolina blue, no big storms in the forecast, just scattered cumulus clouds drifting overhead. Everything felt normal enough that I remember thinking how routine the day was going to be when I was double-checking the lines on one of the students' harnesses. Anyway, after I got them all up in the air, 2 of them were tethered to me in a tandem configuration at first, taking turns. I was cruising about 70 or 80 feet from the rocky outcrop that juts out near Rough Ridge Overlook. That's where the air tends to roll up the most consistently, forming a nice laminar flow, so we could practice maintaining altitude. We were drifting along peacefully when I glimpsed something off to my right that made me do a double take. At first, I assumed it might have been a large turkey vulture, or maybe a hawk, because you do see them out there all the time, catching the same updrafts we do. But as I swung around to get a better look, I realized this thing was far bigger than any bird you'd see in these parts, maybe bigger than any bird you'd see anywhere. It was silhouetted against the sun, so at first I couldn't pick out details other than a massive wingspan, and this bizarre outline that definitely didn't look like a vulture. I'm used to gauging wingspans and how creatures ride thermal columns, and this was no standard flight pattern. This thing seemed to almost hover in place for a few seconds, riding the same current we were in. My tandem student behind me was asking if I saw that giant glider, as he called it. That's when I realized he was describing something with a shape too angular for a normal bird, almost like it had arms or some kind of joint structure that didn't match normal avian anatomy. It's tough to explain the way it moved. It floated more than flapped, sort of like it was letting the wind carry it. But there were subtle movements, like shifting shoulders, if that makes sense, rather than the big wide arcs you'd expect of a condor or eagle. The only way I can describe it is as though it had a humanoid form with wings protruding from its back. I remember someone else on the radio, one of my other students, who was about 40 feet below us. mentioning that he swore he could see what looked like legs tucked up behind it. I can't confirm that, because the glare was intense, but I do recall seeing something like a protrusion beneath the main body. At this point, my first thought was that maybe it was some sort of large drone or ultralight, but I've seen plenty of those, and they don't just hang in a single updraft the way this did. It didn't roar or hum. It was eerily silent. I also tried to rationalize that maybe it was some weird reflection in my visor or our harness camera. But the conversation going on in my ear from the other guys, they were seeing the same thing. The vantage points were all different, so it wasn't just me. We got a better look when it drifted toward the slope and then suddenly shot off sideways, like it caught a cross current that took it about 100 yards down the ridge in a blink. I tell you, I've soared with peregrine falcons out here. They're quick, but they have a style to their speed. This felt unnatural, like it defied the normal physics of how living things typically glide or flap. It was there above the ridgeline, and then it was by the cluster of trees near the Parkway pull-off in no time at all. We came in for a landing not long after that because my tandem passenger was getting a bit spooked by the whole situation. I was trying to remain calm and talk him through the standard landing approach, but my mind was fixated on whether that thing might still be nearby. The second student, after he touched down, indicated he caught a glimpse of the creature's profile against the sky and insisted it looked more like a person with bat wings than a normal bird. That's exactly how he put it, which I found particularly unsettling. I've asked some locals around Linville and Banner Elk if they ever heard of anything like that. I'm not the type to run around proclaiming I saw a giant winged man out here, but you know how mountain folks have old stories. Usually they'll talk about ghost lights or rumored big cats, not so much a winged humanoid. One lady who runs a small gift shop near the Parkway just gave me a sideways glance and told me sometimes folks talk about giant birds or omens in these mountains, but she personally never witnessed anything. I didn't press the issue because I had students with me, and I didn't want them thinking I was some nutty conspiracy enthusiast. For days after, I kept replaying it in my head, wondering if I should phone the rangers or if they'd roll their eyes at me. I know the park rangers around Grandfather Mountain are used to hearing about bear sightings, elk sightings, occasionally the odd cougar rumor, but reporting some giant winged figure that defies classification. I'd probably end up as a footnote in someone's logbook or possibly get brushed off as a prankster, so I stayed quiet. I did, however, scan local news sites to see if anyone else reported something odd. Nothing turned up. Another detail that stands out to me. During the entire episode, the winds were steady. No big gusts that would push paragliders around unexpectedly. So it wasn't a situation where you'd get illusions or weird reflections off the landscape. Visually, everything was crisp, except for the sun glare. My vantage was good. I'd say the encounter lasted maybe a minute or so from the time I noticed it to the time it shot away down the ridge. But that minute felt surreal, like I was observing something from behind a lens of disbelief. Since then, I've had a few more lessons up there, and I haven't seen anything remotely similar. A couple of my students still joke about the flying demon, or whatever name they come up with, but I can tell it's stuck with them too. I've never been a superstitious person, and I don't lean toward cryptid tales. But I'll say this, if you'd asked me a month ago whether something like this could be out there, I'd have firmly said no. Now, I'm not so certain. The Blue Ridge Mountains are vast, and there are pockets where humans hardly ever set foot. If something unusual wanted to stay hidden, these valleys and ridges would be the place to do it. I almost talked myself out of sending this, but I can't stop thinking about what happened along the Natchez Trace a few weeks ago, after my final tour group was dropped off in Natchez late in the afternoon. I'd had this routine for months. Run a sightseeing trip from Tupelo down to Natchez with a couple stops in Jackson, or sometimes Ridgeland, if folks want to poke around the Mississippi Craft Center. But this particular evening, maybe around 5:30 or 5:45, I was driving an empty tour bus back north along the trace, hoping to reach Tupelo before things got too dark. Twilight hits that area a bit later in summer, so I figured I had time to get at least near Kosciuszko when the sun was just setting. As I was passing mile marker 160-something, I'm a little fuzzy because I was focused on a faint scraping sound under the bus dashboard, some glitch in the fuse box that had recently been replaced. I glanced to my right and saw what I initially took to be a very tall man, stepping out from behind a scraggly patch of brush. But as soon as my headlights caught it, and I wish I could articulate this better, it appeared thin, like you could see how its limbs moved in a way that didn't match how a normal person should walk. I slowed down, thinking maybe I was about to see a deer or coyote. Sometimes you see them stand upright for a moment if they're trying to peer over grass. But then the thing changed, or it moved in a way that made its body proportions look off. I can't say it shifted shape in the cartoon sense, but it was more like the figure flickered for a split second, and then it was on all fours, lunging over the roadside. An actual abrupt transformation, taller than a man, but gone. That's when I realized I wasn't imagining something run-of-the-mill. I nearly slammed the brakes, but carrying an empty 56-passenger bus, it's not easy to stop on a dime. Plus, it was enough to scare me into just wanting to get past it. I got to the next turnout. I believe that was near the Cypress Swamp area, if I'm remembering right, and just forced myself to calm down in the parking area. The engine was idling, and the bus's interior lights were flickering, because the main overhead module does that sometimes if I leave it on too long. With the natural hush of the trace at twilight, it was downright eerie. In my side mirror, I thought I saw movement in the trees just for a moment, almost like a reflection or shadow dancing, but I decided I'd rather keep driving than investigate. I've dealt with hearing weird animal sounds on the Natchez Trace before, foxes or owls that screech in the distance, but I've never seen something that defied an easy explanation. The reason I even mentioned the mechanical glitch is that it started that same morning in Tupelo, and I worried it might cause electrical issues with my headlights. Tour buses have so many electrical components, and if you risk your brakes or headlights going out at dusk, it's a big hazard. I remember complaining about it to the maintenance guy earlier that day, and he told me it was probably just a loose fuse. Said it reminded him of a time he saw some bright orb drifting over the highway near Ridgeland one night when the bus lights started going haywire. He joked maybe the electronics were sensitive to something supernatural. I brushed it off at the time, but after seeing that strange figure, I don't know what to think anymore. Anyway, I got back on the road, tried to stay focused on the center line. The twilight was turning into that deeper purple, and the entire scene felt heavy, like the air was pressing down. There wasn't much traffic, but I did pass a pair of motorcycles further up near milepost 172, and in my side mirror, I noticed one of the riders turning his head, as if he saw something off to the side. Perhaps that was the same figure, or maybe they were just curious why a giant bus was humming along at a slower speed than usual. Either way, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched from the tree line. It was then I kept going back in my head to what I'd seen. This tall, lanky form that didn't move like a normal man, but seemed to go down on all fours in a blink. Eventually, I made it to a small rest area near French Camp, well after dark by then, and parked the bus for a breather. Another driver was there, a fellow running a smaller shuttle. He didn't come out and say anything directly about strange sightings, but in an offhand way, he mentioned he heard something near the woods that gave him goosebumps. He said he was sure there was a coyote or maybe a bobcat out there, but insisted it sounded wrong, like it was trying to mimic a human voice or a bird call, but couldn't quite get it. He told me he got back in his driver's seat quickly and waited it out. I wanted to share what I'd seen, but I wasn't sure how to begin a conversation about a gaunt figure flickering between forms, so I just told him that the roads can be weird at dusk. I ended up bunking at a cheap motel further north because my nerves were so frayed. By the time I settled in, it was after 11, and all I could think of was the suddenness of the shift from upright to on all fours. It wasn't graceful, more like it was forced or glitchy, if that makes any sense. What gets me is how real it felt. I've had illusions on the road before, where my eyes trick my brain into seeing something out of place at night. But this was different. There was mass form, some bizarre presence stepping on the blacktop right in front of me. I keep replaying the scene in my mind, wondering if it was something that intentionally let itself be seen. The Natchez Trace is so full of history and strange lore anyway, from old native stories to rumors of apparitions near certain unmarked graves. And I admit, I've had a passing fascination with weird sightings, but I never expected to witness something so undeniably bizarre. The fact that it was near twilight, which is often touted as some liminal space between day and night, adds another layer to my own dread. I've driven the route a few times since, and I'll admit I've been more on edge, especially around that same stretch. I even tried to replicate the experience in my mind, looking around the same patch of brush along the roadside, driving at about the same speed, around 45 miles per hour or so, but I never caught sight of it again. Part of me is relieved, but part of me wonders if it let me see it for a reason, or if it was just wandering. Maybe it was just passing through, and I was in the right or wrong spot at the right time. Regardless, the memory is etched pretty deep now. I can't quite define it any other way than calling it some kind of shapeshifter. Wanted to share something I've been carrying around for longer than I'd like to admit. A few years before I retired from the Army, I was doing some routine archival data reviews. Nothing glamorous, mostly scanning old coded teletypes and cross-referencing them with operational logs. I'd been in intelligence for about 25 years, and believe me, after a while, you start seeing patterns everywhere, even in the most mundane of doc stacks. It was one of those late nights where I was finishing up redactions when I came across a handful of references to incidents in the Midwest that caught my eye. They were hidden in the middle of an otherwise dry batch of communications. I can't say down to the letter what those references said because of classification regulations, but I can tell you they all pointed to coded references about UFO sightings near certain nuclear missile silos. Now, I'm initially thinking, are these just your typical false alarms or misidentifications? That's common enough. But the wording was strange, very narrow phrasing that looked like standard code for aerial anomalies. Except usually we'd see that kind of language used for foreign aircraft reconnaissance, or something we needed plausible deniability on. But these logs were all from the early to mid-1970s. They specifically mentioned sightings of discs, or bright lights hovering around launch facilities, and not just once or twice. What struck me was the repeated notes about malfunctions. Some communications channels went down, or missile readiness statuses got scrambled during these sightings. I remember thinking how weird it was that it kept showing up in the same kind of coded language used when an incident was to be compartmentalized. Usually that's for hush-hush espionage or covert ops. It wasn't typical for something presumably as visible as an actual unidentified craft. I even recall once overhearing someone in the hallway, back in '96, remark about how spooked a friend of theirs was after being posted to a site near Great Falls, Montana, but he never went into detail. He just said something like, "They keep seeing lights, and it's messing with the system readiness." That's obviously not a direct quote, I'm paraphrasing, but it rang in my head after reading those coded logs. Initially, I brushed it off. You see, we got plenty of strange references back then, and it usually turned out to be something perfectly explainable. A lost Cessna, weird ground reflections, or atmospheric phenomena. But these particular reports got flagged as O2 priority, which, let's just say you don't usually toss that around for some local pilot. I went down a rabbit hole after that, combing records from late 1974 to early 1977, because that's when the biggest cluster of these references popped up. I found maybe 12 or 13 separate mentions across different bases. If it were just a one-off or two-off, I'd chalk it up to rumor. But they all had something to do with bright, disc-shaped objects and temporary power or system anomalies at a silo just outside, like near Roy, Montana, or between Minot and Bismarck. One of the more bizarre tangents in the files that I'll never forget was a short incident reference about an object being tracked briefly by NORAD. They didn't call it a UFO, of course. They used language like unidentified tracking source, or something along those lines. Cheyenne Mountain apparently picked up an anomaly that moved in a way that defied what we'd usually classify under standard flight patterns. The anecdote was so short it could have been a forgotten phone note, but it was there. I ended up telling a colleague in the lunchroom about it, and they half-jokingly said that they'd heard rumors of a bright object near Echo Flight at Malmstrom back in '67 that had supposedly shut down multiple missiles. They didn't give me details, just that it was one of those hush-hush stories the old-timers used to swap at the bar. Indirectly got me curious whether these coded references were connected to that rumored event. Anyway, after finding all those anomalies, I did request additional logs from a data repository we used to keep in an underground storage facility somewhere in Pennsylvania. It was an old government building, practically a relic from the Cold War, with these huge climate-controlled vaults. Digging in that place felt like rummaging through the basement of a library after hours. Half the stuff you find is mislabeled or still in archaic classification categories. That's where I realized the pattern extended beyond the 1970s. There were smaller references in the early 80s, and at least one from the early 90s. Consistently, they revolve around sightings described as luminous, silent crafts near active missile sites. Not all in one region either. Some up near Grand Forks, others near Whiteman in Missouri, even a scattered note about F.E. Warren in Wyoming, though that one's a complete question mark to me because it was so lightly referenced. When I pieced it all together, it was obvious enough there's more to the sightings than random confusion. The coded language alone was a giveaway, because if it had been something easily explained, it wouldn't have ended up so deeply buried. This wasn't the typical format for swamp gas or misperceived planet sightings. The detail about electronic or mechanical malfunctions happening in tandem with these sightings was the biggest red flag. I spent years dealing with how we track and label foreign technology. If something from another country was messing with our silo operations, it would be a top-tier concern. But the data readout style just didn't match that scenario at all. I told another friend, an Air Force vet who served in missile maintenance, about how I kept running into mention of these bright lights. He laughed at first and said something to the effect of, "Oh, you've gone full tinfoil hat," but then confided that back in 1982, he was near Malmstrom when the base rumor mill was buzzing about unknown lights over the silos. That's the best he could remember. He said they were told not to talk about it, or they'd face disciplinary action for fueling speculation. He didn't witness it personally, but the hush-hush environment obviously made an impression on him. I know your YouTube channel covers accounts like this, so I've been tempted for years to share it. I don't have actual raw documents anymore. I had to turn in all that stuff when I retired. Plus, scanning or copying them was never an option given the classification levels. But I have my notes, and I've never quite been able to shake it from my mind. The amount of cross-corroboration I saw in official logs, coded references, plus those hushed hallway conversations, I just can't see it all being a series of mundane aircraft or illusions. Maybe the strangest part is how rarely these kinds of references pop up in open sources. If these events were truly unremarkable, we'd have publicly available records, or at least more rumors. But it's all hush-hush. I sometimes think about how many other people in intelligence or operations might have glanced at the same logs and had the same reaction I did. But you know how it goes. Talking about UFOs can be career suicide in many circles, so folks clamp their mouths shut. One last detail I recall is that in some of the older logs from the mid-70s, the coded comments included mention of unidentified occupant presence, but the wording was so cryptic that I couldn't parse if it meant they saw beings, or if they just suspected someone was on board the craft. It never said anything about landed craft or footprints, nothing that dramatic. It was more along the lines of, potential occupant involvement suggested, no direct contact. That notation made me do a double take. If these sightings were just about lights in the sky, we wouldn't normally see mention of occupant presence. That's way above standard, unidentified aerial phenomenon codes. And it was used more than once, which is the part that still hangs with me. Anyway, that's the gist of it. It's not exactly a neat, tidy narrative, just bits and pieces from years in the archives. I hope this gives you something to consider against the other stories out there. It's been a weight off my shoulders just putting it down in words. The only reason I even decided to bring it forward now is that I'm out of the uniform, and I don't feel as bound by that old culture of silence. I never know who to share it with, so I figured you're collecting these accounts for your channel and might appreciate the perspective of someone who's been in the intelligence side of things. The deeper I dug, the more I was left with the unmistakable impression that these sightings were not random illusions or test planes. They were recognized as something else entirely by the very people responsible for safeguarding some of our most sensitive strategic assets. And whenever it popped up in official logs, they were coded, compartmentalized, and buried so thoroughly it practically guaranteed nobody outside a very small circle would ever see them. Subject: strange knocking at the windows. Last week I've been up here at the Tamarack Resort Lodge, though I guess it's more of an overflow lodge a couple of miles up from the main runs, for about 3 weeks now, taking on caretaker duties while the owners handle some off-season renovations down the road. They weren't too specific on the timeline for my stay, but I'm used to it. This isn't the first time I've had to stick around through weird hours in a mostly empty building. Usually, it's just creaks, random animals knocking over trash bins, occasional storms rocking the trees, all the typical stuff you'd expect. But on March 13th, something happened that still makes my scalp tingle when I replay it in my head. I was on the second floor that night, checking the radiator in one of the closed guest rooms because something was rattling whenever the temperature dropped below 28 degrees. The radiator was fine. It's just old pipes that haven't had a good flush in years. It must have been around 2:50, or maybe closer to 3 o'clock in the morning by the time I wrapped up. I remember because I glanced at my phone hoping to catch a decent internet signal. Even up here, sometimes you can snag a single bar of service if the clouds part or the wind is right. But that night, I couldn't get any connection. Typical for this area. I started making my way back to the caretaker's quarters, which are essentially a small suite with a bunk, a desk, and a small kitchenette. That's when I heard these soft knocks, or taps, at a window down the hallway behind me. At first, I thought it was an animal, maybe a stray raccoon or even a large bird that got confused by some light inside. We had 1 or 2 run-ins with big owls here last season, but I heard it again just as I got to the staircase. A deliberate, almost rhythmic series of knocks. Not frantic like a trapped animal, but more like someone lightly testing the glass. I called out, not in any official way, just a general, "Who's out there?" kind of call, though I'm sure my voice was shaky. There was no answer, obviously, but the knocks stopped the moment I spoke. I stood there kind of frozen, waiting for something else to happen. Then came this strange scraping sound, like nails or claws being lightly dragged over the window's surface. I'm not exaggerating when I say I nearly dropped my flashlight. It's that quiet up here at night, and these sounds cut through the stillness like nothing else. My gut reaction was to assume maybe a large pine branch had come loose, scratched a window. Sometimes the wind does carry branches or small debris, but there was almost no wind that evening. If anything, it was just a light breeze from the southwest, which I only know because I checked the weather earlier to figure out if we'd be dealing with more snow. I went down the corridor, careful not to flick on every light so as not to blind myself, and peeked out one of the windows in the lounge area. There wasn't much to see except faint moonlight on the slopes. The only sign of life was the dim glow from the direction of the main resort lights in the distance, probably about a mile downhill. No footprints on the deck, but fresh snow can sometimes cover tracks quickly if it's coming down even a little, and it was sputtering some flurries. I was about to turn away when I heard that knock again, this time from the far corner window near the old game room, which is currently empty except for a couple of stacked chairs. Whoever or whatever it was had moved around the north side of the lodge. I swear I felt my stomach lurch. I kept thinking maybe it was some local messing with me or a lost hiker playing a prank. But honestly, who would come all the way up around 3 in the morning in near freezing conditions doing knocks like that? It wasn't a random, curious kind of knock. It felt more deliberate, like it knew I was inside and was trying to get my attention. I tried telling myself to calm down, because I'd heard old legends in these areas, especially from a local friend in McCall who told me about the Wendigo stories that swirl around the forested parts of Idaho. He said people claim to hear it calling their name or knocking on their windows, He always half laughed when mentioning it, but insisted that the lore was real enough to spook the older folks who've lived here for generations. I never gave it much thought, just chalked it up to local lore. But I couldn't help remembering that stuff in that exact moment. I stood there trying to keep my head on straight, figuring I should circle around to the north side exit, slip on my boots, and see what was out there. As soon as I started to walk, I heard the knocks again, but in a different pattern. Like 3 short knocks, pause, then 3 more. Only this time they were joined by what sounded like a low hiss or something. That's the best way I can describe it. A faint, almost drawn-out exhalation, but it felt unnervingly intentional. I made it outside through the main lobby door, stepping into about 6 inches of packed snow. The temperature was dropping, so the porch boards were a bit slick. I quietly moved alongside the building, my flashlight scanning the perimeter. And the weirdest part is, I didn't see single footprints. The snow wasn't falling heavily enough to fill in fresh ones that fast. No sign of any animals, no sign of anything. But I had this feeling like I was being watched from beyond the tree line. You ever get that sense that there's a presence locked onto you from somewhere out in the dark? That's exactly how it felt. I think I walked around the entire lodge twice. Eventually, I just retreated inside, but the entire time my ears were perked up, half expecting another series of knocks or scrapes. Once I was back in, there was nothing, absolute silence. I ended up staying awake the rest of that night, dozing off occasionally but mostly snagging short bursts of rest on the old couch in the lounge, wrapped in a thick comforter, with the lights off so I could see out the windows. I didn't see anything else for the rest of that night, except a distant shape moving along the slope around 5 a.m. But it could have been a deer or an elk. It moved fast, but it was still too dark to make out details. Now I know I can't say for certain it was a Wendigo out there. Seems crazy, right? I keep telling myself it must have been some stray dog or a coyote that got right up to the building, or maybe even a person messing around. But none of those explanations really sit right when I replay those moments in my mind. The knocks were too precise, the scraping too controlled. What's bizarre is, when I told a neighbor about it, this older guy who maintains the smaller cabins by West Mountain Road, he said locals blame Wendigo or forest spirits whenever weird stuff like this happens. He told me about a story from the late 70s where a few folks near Cascade had heard tapping on their windows in the dead of winter, followed by sightings of a tall, lean figure with sunken eyes standing at the edge of the forest. Not sure how much is rumor or old wives' tales, but it's enough to keep my imagination wondering, especially when you're alone on an isolated property. Since that night, I haven't heard the knocks again, but a couple of times, usually around 3 or 4 in the morning, I've had the sense that something is walking around outside. The motion sensor lights on the north side flicker on and off for no apparent reason. I check the cameras, but they're older models that don't record reliably, and half the time they're set off by the smallest things: shadows, branches swaying, or big gusts. None of the recordings show a clear figure, but there was one clip saved from a few nights ago that had around 12 seconds of the light on, with a faint silhouette crossing in front of one of the windows. It could be anything, but it sure didn't move like a bear or any 4-legged animal. Anyway, I'm trying to keep my head on straight and just do my job until the owners get back, or until my contract ends. I can't exactly abandon the lodge, and aside from that one night, it's mostly normal up here. The isolation definitely feeds your imagination if you let it. Still, I can't shake the feeling that whatever was knocking on the windows might come back. I've even considered putting up some homemade motion alarms, little noise traps made from fishing line and bells, although that's probably a bit extreme. If nothing else, it might give me some peace of mind to catch some proper sleep. I don't have much else to share about it right now. No broken windows, no footprints that I can confidently chalk up to anything unusual. But those knocks were enough to rattle me. In case you hear from others around this area who've experienced something similar, this is what happened. Might just be the old legends stirring up my nerves, but I figured you might find it worth looking into for your YouTube channel, especially with all the talk about strange entities roaming these woods at night. I've been going back and forth on whether to write this out. But after stumbling on your YouTube channel and seeing those other Bigfoot encounters, I figured you might appreciate hearing about something my son and I experienced last fall in Clinton County, Pennsylvania. This happened in late November of 2022, right around the weekend before Thanksgiving if I remember correctly. We were in the Sproul State Forest area, near the Kettle Creek watershed, where we go every year for hunting season. I've hunted there for decades, going back to when I was a teenager and used to tag along with my father, and now I bring my own son, who's 28 this year. That particular day, we started out earlier than usual. There'd been some talk around the town of Renovo that the deer had been on the move at dawn, so we wanted to post up on a ridge we like that overlooks a small creek valley. The weather had been back and forth. It was cold enough that there was a bit of frost, but not so brutally cold that you couldn't sit still for a few hours. We parked off Tamarack Road near an old logging trail and hiked in, planning to wait until after sunrise to see if any bucks came by. It was normal for the first few hours, just me and my son, whispering now and then, more out of habit than necessity, because I doubt deer can hear the little noises we were making from quite that distance. We spotted a few does milling about the far side of the ridge, but not much else. Eventually, we decided to start moving around to see if we could track anything, so we worked our way along a game trail near the creek. As we were walking, I noticed something off to my right. It was some subtle sign at first, like a wide swath of flattened brush that looked too wide for a deer. We see deer paths all the time, and I know a bear can leave a decent trail if it's moving through thick cover. But this was weird because some saplings were almost bent over in a uniform direction, like something heavy had just barreled through. I mentioned this to my son in passing, and he just shrugged, saying it might have been a group of deer sprinting in single file. I wasn't so sure, but we kept going. I still kick myself for not taking a photograph of the odd footprints we found about a quarter mile after that. It wasn't a neat, crisp print, more like an elongated shape pressed into the mud that had partially dried. The reason it stuck out was the spacing. Each impression, if that was indeed a set of footprints, was far enough apart that it must have been something with a much bigger stride than any person I know. But I rationalized it at the time, thinking maybe it was two different animals that stepped in roughly the same line, creating an illusion of a large track. We cut across a slope we rarely go on because it's covered in rocks and downed trees, and that's when we found the strangest thing I've seen in over 40 years of hunting. Up in the branches of a sizable oak, maybe 10 feet off the ground, was a deer carcass wedged in the crook of two large branches. I don't mean a partial carcass that a bear might have dragged up if we were out west with mountain lions or something. This was the entire body of a mid-sized doe, definitely not a small fawn. Her hindquarters were chewed up, but the entire torso and head were intact. It's almost like she'd been lifted and placed there. Neither of us could come up with an explanation that didn't sound wild, because around here, black bears sometimes drag carrion around, but I've never seen them lift a whole deer into a tree that high. We were trying to piece together if maybe someone was playing a twisted trick, but there was no sign of rope, no bullet or arrow wound that we could see immediately, though we didn't get extremely close until later. My son muttered something about how it gave him a bad feeling, and that maybe we shouldn't stick around. He grew up hearing my father's old stories about weird noises in the woods, so he's not new to these sorts of local legends, but I could tell this unnerved him. At first, I joked about it being some bizarre local prank, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something about that scene was just off. We noticed the area under the tree was all torn up, like something big had paced around, or something spooked had taken off in a hurry. I half wondered if we were about to stumble onto a bear's stash, but that doesn't sit right with me. The branches supporting the carcass were thicker, sure, but the angle would have been awkward as hell for a bear, and I've never known a bear to carefully balance a deer in the crook of a branch. It was almost too neatly set up. The hair on the back of my neck was standing, I'll admit that. We lingered there longer than we should have, trying to reason out how the carcass got up there. The tree itself was old, with a wide trunk that would be hard for a human to climb without gear, and we saw no scratch marks from climbing irons or spurs. The bark wasn't peeled in a typical pattern I'd expect if a heavy animal had clawed its way up. There were definitely marks, but they looked more like large scuffs, almost as if something big and very strong had scaled the trunk with minimal slipping. The weirdest part might have been the smell. We got a whiff of a foul odor that wasn't just typical rotting meat. Any hunter knows that smell. This was more like a wet dog mixed with a stagnant, musky stench. I've come across coyote dens that reeked, but this was different. I remembered reading about sightings in the Rothrock State Forest from years back, where people claimed to have heard whoops and strange chatter. I always dismissed those as tall tales, but standing under that tree, I found myself thinking about all the people who talk about Bigfoot messing with hunters, or leaving partially eaten game as a territorial marker. I'm not a huge believer in that stuff, but I'll admit it popped into my head in that moment. My son later said that he'd recalled stories from the Clearfield County area, specifically near Moshannon State Forest, where some hapless campers apparently encountered large footprints and scary vocalizations at night. We started connecting dots that probably shouldn't be connected, but you know how the mind runs wild in a scenario like that. We ended up deciding to loop around the area, sort of giving that spot a wide berth because we didn't want to run into whatever put that carcass in the tree. The rest of the hunt was uneventful. We saw some does, never got a shot at a buck, and by afternoon we made our way back to the truck. The entire walk back, I felt uneasy, like we were being watched. Could be paranoia because when you see something that defies logic, you start imagining all sorts of possibilities. My son didn't say a whole lot for a while, which is strange for him. He's usually chatty. That night, we went back to our camp near Renovo, which some folks just call an old huntin' shack. It's the typical Pennsylvania bare-bones cabin, with a wood stove and no running water. We told a couple of guys we know about the carcass in the tree, and they just laughed it off as, a bear's gotta eat. But I could tell by the look on their faces that they thought it was odd too. One suggested we should head back there with a camera to get pictures, but I'm not the type who's quick to gather evidence. I guess I just wanted to enjoy the rest of the hunt without spooking myself. We never did return to that exact tree, and I kind of regret it because now I'd like to investigate more thoroughly. Still, I keep thinking about the spacing of those strange footprints we saw earlier in the day. I remember the stride being so long that, at first, I thought it was two prints partially overlapping, but it almost looked like something with a massive gait. And that area of forest, especially up near the steep ridges, is so dense that a lot of normal hikers never go that far in. If a big creature was living out there, it wouldn't shock me that it remains mostly unnoticed. I recall an old local story. This was from a friend I had who claimed his grandfather saw something large and hairy behind their farm. That Bigfoot in Pennsylvania sometimes hunts deer. I always laughed at that until I saw the deer in the tree. Now I'm not so sure. I'm not trying to convince anyone. It's just that in the days after, I couldn't think of a single natural predator in our region that would put a presumably fresh deer carcass so high up in a tree. And it didn't look like it was gutted or field dressed by a person. It was torn in a savage way. The best word I have is placed. Placed in the tree. I guess it's possible it was some bizarre prank, but that's a lot of work to spook someone who might not even walk through that area. The muzzleloader season was still a few weeks away, and we were in a pretty remote part of the woods. Just doesn't make sense. The only reason we even found it was because we got bored with waiting and decided to track deeper than usual. I keep telling myself I'm not a Bigfoot believer, but I can't deny that I saw something completely out of place that day. Maybe there's a rational explanation, but I haven't heard one yet. My son talked to a buddy of his who hunts out near the Allegheny National Forest, and that buddy swears he's heard strange howls at night. But you know how stories get embellished. I suppose this is no different. All I know is what we saw. Mangled deer, up in a tree, scuffed up bark that might indicate giant claws or hands, and footprints that don't match any typical animal's track that I'm familiar with.